I personally believe that it's impossible to understand Bible prophecy without understanding the book of Daniel and the book of Ezekiel. I say that because the book of Daniel and the book of Ezekiel give us a lot of valuable information about the key players in the tribulation and about the sequence of events and even the events that are going to take place during that time. In fact, these two books actually lay the foundation on which the book of Revelation is built. In fact, as I was going through the book of Revelation, I realized I'm going to be in trouble if I don't start now studying the book of Daniel. And so I was actually studying the book of Daniel and the book of Ezekiel and the book of Revelation at the same time while I was preparing for this series. That's how important these books are. And I'll give you some examples to illustrate what I'm talking about. Because of Daniel, we know that the first horseman of the apocalypse is the Antichrist. Also because of the book of Daniel, we know that he is actually going to broker a 7-year peace treaty with Israel. We also know that he's going to build or let them rebuild the temple. But contrary to what most people think, when the Antichrist first comes on the scene and he begins to ascend in power, not all of the nations are going to support him. And we know that because of the book of Ezekiel. If it wasn't for the book of Ezekiel, we might not know that. And that is the reason that World War III begins shortly after the tribulation starts. In fact, the second horseman of the apocalypse actually initiates World War III. And the book of Ezekiel gives us a lot of information about that war. It reveals the countries that are involved. It tells us who starts the war and why. It also tells us how it ends and how God is going to use it to accomplish His goals or His plan. If you remember last week, I told you that God has 5 goals that He wants to accomplish during the tribulation. He is going to use World War III to accomplish some of those goals. Now, without the books of Daniel and the book of Ezekiel, we wouldn't know all of this. That's why I say that it's impossible to understand the book of Revelation without understanding these two books. So before we study the second horseman of the apocalypse, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the book of Daniel. And then, when we study the second horseman of the apocalypse, we're also going to study Ezekiel chapters 37, 38, and 39. And as we go through the book of Revelation, we're going to refer back to these two books from time to time. So let's do a quick overview of the parts in Daniel that are pertinent to the book of Revelation. And I hope you know that when I say quick, I don't mean 20 or 30 minutes. I mean 2 to 3 weeks, possibly 4. That is a quick overview of the book of Daniel, but we have to do it. And the reason we have to do it is because the book of Daniel is the key to understanding certain parts of the book of Revelation. And we're at one of those parts. If I just tell you that, oh yeah, the second horseman of the apocalypse comes on the scene and World War III starts, and then I go on to the third seal, guess what? You really don't know what's taking place. You don't understand why the third seal and the fourth seal are just natural occurrences as a result of World War III. You have got to go back to the book of Ezekiel, and we've got to understand the key nations that are involved in this, why they start the war, and why God is using it. Does that make sense? So, it's not an option. We have to do it. So, we're going to begin with Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2 of the book of Daniel. So, turn to Daniel chapter 2, verse 1. Now, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. And his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Now, how many of you ever had a dream that's either so frightening, or maybe it was so vivid, or maybe it was just so powerful that it woke you up? Anyone ever had those type of dreams? I've had those type of dreams. I think everyone has. Well, that's what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. It was so powerful, it was so vivid, that when he woke up from it, he was troubled. The word troubled is translated from the Hebrew word pa'am, which means to disturb or to upset. So basically, the dream really upset him. He must have just stood up in his bed, and he's probably having sweat running down his face. And he was upset by it, and we know he was really upset because he immediately summoned the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans. Look at verse number 2. Then the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans for to show the king his dreams. So they came and they stood before the king. Now, let me explain these 4 groups of people, all right? Magicians were what we would call fortune tellers. They claimed to have the ability to tell the future. It could be with cards, it could be with animals' bones, but you would come to them and they would be able to tell your future, what's going to take place. Astrologers also claimed to be able to foretell future events, but they did it by studying the stars. Sorcerers claimed to be able to communicate with the dead. They also practiced what we call magic. In other words, they used potions and they would cast spells. They were what you thought of when you thought of Merlin back in King Arthur's day, right? A sorcerer. And last but not least, you had the Chaldeans. Now, the Chaldeans are interesting. Chaldeans were what we would call scientists. They studied the sciences. But they were also philosophers. In other words, they loved wisdom, so they studied philosophy. And if the king wanted to know what was the wise thing to do, he would summon the Chaldeans. He didn't care about the magicians. He didn't care about the sorcerers or the astrologers, unless he thought there was something in the future that he should know. So what he would do is he would call the Chaldeans in, the wise men, and he would say, I've got a dilemma, or I've got a problem. And he would lay it out for them, and then they would come up with wise things for him to do. And then he would check it with what the stars said. And he would check it with the magicians. Could they foretell what would happen? Well, of course, these 3 groups are listening to the wise men. And they're trying to make it vague enough that they can please the king. But if it doesn't turn out like the king expects it to, they still won't be in trouble. Does that make sense? And so that's these 4 groups of people. Now, or groups of people. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were a part of this group. Now, probably the majority of you are not familiar with those names, are you? But you are familiar with the Babylonian names that were given to them. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were also known as Shadrach, Meshach, and here in the south we say Abednego, but it's actually Abednego, all right? Now, after the king summoned these 4 groups to his chambers, he told them that he had a dream, but he couldn't remember it. Now, that's one view. Most scholars believe that he couldn't remember it, but you know, it really doesn't say that. If you read through it, one of 2 things happened. Either he couldn't remember it, or he purposely didn't want to tell them because it was so important. He knew that these people were all the time trying to blow smoke at him. Does that make sense? So we're going to look at it like he couldn't remember it. So he wanted them to tell him what he had dreamed, and he wanted them to tell him what the interpretation of it was. And if they couldn't do that, he said, I will kill you, and I will turn your houses into rubble. And when he said houses into rubble, he meant, I'm going to wipe out your family. I'm going to take all your possessions. And to send a message to everyone, we're going to destroy your house. So when everyone walks by that, they're going to know what happened and why. He could do that. Look at Daniel chapter 2, verses 2 through 6. He called in his magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers, and he demanded that they tell him what he had dreamed. As they stood before the king, he said, I have had a dream that deeply troubles me, and I must know what it means. Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, Long live the king. Tell us the dream, and we will tell you what it means. But the king said to the astrologers, Now I'm serious about this. If you don't tell me what my dream was, and you don't tell me what it means, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. But if you tell me what I dreamed and what the dream means, I will give you many wonderful gifts and honors. Just tell me the dream and what it means. Now, without being disrespectful, what did they do? Well, they told Nebuchadnezzar, you're crazy. No one can do that. No man can tell anyone what they've dreamed. We just don't have the ability to do that. Only God can do that. So they tried to reason with Nebuchadnezzar. If he could tell them what he dreamed, then they could interpret the dream. And that's when it hit Nebuchadnezzar. And maybe he knew this all along. He realized if they couldn't tell him what he dreamed, that really meant they couldn't interpret it. Once they heard the dream, he knew that they'd just make something up. that sounded reasonable, that sounded good. Yeah, that sounds like that works. The only true way to know if they were interpreting the dream correctly was if they could also tell him what he had dreamed. And that's what he demanded of them. He said, tell me what I've dreamed, and then you can tell me what the interpretation of it is. And if you can't do that, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to put every one of you to death. Look at Daniel chapter 2, verses 7 through 13. They said again, please, your majesty, tell us the dream, and we will tell you what it means. The king replied, I know what you're doing. You're stalling for time, because you know I'm serious when I say, if you don't tell me the dream, you're doomed. So you have conspired to tell me lies, hoping I'm going to change my mind. But tell me the dream, and then I'll know for sure that you can tell me what it means. The astrologers replied to the king, no one on earth can tell the king his dream, and no king, however great and powerful, has ever asked such a thing of any of his magicians, enchanters, or astrologers. Now they're trying to play on that. No king has ever done this before, and it's not right for you to demand this or to expect this. The king's demand is impossible. No one except the gods can tell you your dream, and they do not live here among people. The king was furious when he heard this, and he ordered that all the wise men of Babylon be executed. And because of the king's decree, men were sent to find and kill Daniel and his friends. Now that's very important for you to see that. Daniel must not have been with them, because verse 13 tells us that they had to send men to find Daniel and his friends. Now, I believe personally that there's a reason that Daniel wasn't with them. Had Daniel been with them, I know what he would have done. He would have told the king, just wait for a minute and let me go pray, and I'm sure God's going to tell me, because he had a relationship with God, what you dreamed, and I'll be able to tell you what you dreamed, and I'll be able to interpret that. And then what would have happened is all the other groups would have been off the hook. Or the other groups could have claimed, well, I could have done that, but since Daniel stepped forward and he beat me to it, I'll let him do it. But you know, I truly believe that God wanted to make sure that everyone admitted they couldn't do it before Daniel stepped forward. So Daniel went to the king and he told him that if he gave him just a little bit of time and allowed him to pray, he'd not only tell him the dream, he'd tell him the interpretation of it. Look at Daniel chapter 2, verse 16. Daniel went at once to see the king and requested more time to tell the king what the dream meant. That's really interesting, because this has to do with the book of Revelation. You're going to find that out in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had an all-night prayer meeting. You might call it a do-or-die meeting. Look at Daniel chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Shadrach, Mishael, Meshach, and Azariah, Abednego. He urged them to plead for mercy from God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Now, sometime during the night, sometime while they were praying, Daniel had a vision of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. He actually saw what Nebuchadnezzar dreamed. Look at verse number 19. It says, then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Now, this doesn't mean in a dream. It is a vision. It is an open-eyed trance, but it happened at night. Literally, he was able to see what Nebuchadnezzar had dreamed. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And I want you to notice that last little part of that verse. Daniel didn't rush off to the king immediately. After he received the vision, what did he do? He started worshiping God. And you'll find that in verses 20 through 23, but because we want to move on, we're not going to look at that. And then, only after he continued to worship God, didn't matter how dire the situation was, didn't matter that his neck was on the line, God gave him the answer, God deserved the worship. So he began to worship God. And when he finished his worship time, then and only then did he go off to see the king. Look at verse 26 through 30. The king said to Daniel, also known as Belteshazzar, "Is this true? Can you tell me what my dream was and what it means?" Now notice he says, "Is this true?" Why did he say that? Because when the captain of the guard came in, you know what he said? "I have found someone who can interpret the dream." You know, everyone wants to take credit. Have you ever noticed that? He wanted the king to know, "You're really upset. That bothered me, king. I love you. You know I love you like a brother. So I've been looking for someone who can do that. And I found someone who can do that." So, of course, when Daniel comes in, that's why Nebuchadnezzar says, "Is this true? Can you tell me what my dream was and what it means?" Daniel replied, "There are no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or fortune tellers who can reveal the king's secret. But there is a God in heaven. And this God in heaven reveals secrets. And he has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the future. Now, I will tell you your dream, the visions you saw as you lay on your bed. While your majesty was sleeping, you dreamed about coming events. He who reveals secrets has shown you what is going to happen. And it is not because I am wiser than anyone else that I know the secrets of your dream, but because God wants you to understand what was in your heart." Now, I want you to notice what Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar. He told him, "You dreamed about coming events." And he told him that God was showing him through this dream what will happen in the future. That's why this is important to the book of Revelation. What Daniel is going to reveal, the interpretation of this dream has a bearing on the book of Revelation. There are certain things we know. We know that there's going to be 10 federated kingdoms that's going to rise up out of the revived Roman Empire. How do we know that? The book of Daniel. We know that the Antichrist will come from one of those 10 kingdoms. How do we know that? The book of Daniel. We know that a peace treaty is going to take place. How do we know that? The book of Daniel. You see, all the way back then, around 600 BC, God revealed the events that were going to happen. But God did something else, which I love. He also revealed other events that has no bearing on that. And he laid out in detail what would happen. And the reason he did that is so that we can look back and say, "Oh my gosh, it happened just the way God said it would." And now when we look to the future of what has yet to come to pass, we can know with certainty it will come to pass, because when we look back in history, what God prophesied, what God said would come to pass, did to the letter. Does that make sense? Now, that's very, very important that you realize that God was telling Nebuchadnezzar what was going to happen in the future. Now, about 90% of what was in the dream has already happened. It happened over the next 900 years, from about 600 BC to about 364 AD. And it happened just like Daniel said it would happen. As I said, perfectly, to a T. You can look back and you go, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe that." That's why so many liberal scholars actually reject the book of Daniel. Do you know why they reject the book of Daniel? Because when they study history, they say, hey, that's not possible. No man could predict the future so accurately and with so many details unless someone actually did it after all the events took place, and then he only claimed that another person way back in time predicted it. And that's why you see these liberal scholars saying, "Well, Daniel didn't write that, it was someone blah, blah, blah." But there's no proof of that. In fact, we can go back and we can find proof that no, the person who penned this was Daniel, and who lived at the time of Nebuchadnezzar. And he died before any of these events that he prophesied, with the exception of one, and he only got to see it come to fruition. But all the rest of the events, he died before they ever happened, but he prophesied them because God had revealed the future to him. Now, as I said, 90% of what Daniel said would happen has already occurred. But 10% of what he said would happen hasn't happened yet. It has yet to be fulfilled. Now, guess when it's going to be fulfilled? In the tribulation. The part that has yet to be fulfilled will be fulfilled during the tribulation. And it's amazing how John's revelation ties right into Daniel's revelation. In fact, Daniel actually supplies information that makes the book of Revelation understandable. In other words, if we did not have the book of Daniel, we wouldn't understand a lot of the things that John wrote in the book of Revelation. But because of the book of Daniel, it all makes sense. It all fits together. And now as we begin to look at all of these events that's going to take place, and we go back to the book of Daniel, we go, oh man, that's the missing key. Oh, that's the part that he was talking about. Oh, can you believe this? John prophesies the very same thing, but he sees it differently. It's a different vision, but it has the very same meaning. How cool! That's the way it is. It's kind of like the key the book of Daniel is in the book of Ezekiel. It's the key that unlocks the book of Revelation. Now, let's look at Nebuchadnezzar's dream and the interpretation of the dream. And you need to understand, as we study this, there's only a small portion of it that really applies to Revelation of this dream. All right? But we're going to see that Daniel had other visions. But we also need to study those so we understand that if God said this is going to happen, and it did, how much more confident can we be that what he's saying in Revelation is going to take place? All right, so let's look at Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and then we'll look at the interpretation. Look at verses 31 through 35. Here Daniel is telling him what he dreamed. In your vision, your majesty, you saw standing before you a huge, shining statue of a man. It was a frightening sight. The head of the statue was made of fine gold. Now, the reason it was frightening is because it was a huge statue of a man. It wasn't a little bitty statue. This thing was huge. And it says the head of the statue was made of fine gold. Its chest and arms were silver. Its belly and thighs. Now, that's really not a good translation. Really what it's saying is its belly, and it goes around and says its buttocks. All right? They just didn't want to say that, neither did the other translators, so it doesn't say that. But no, it's the abdomen and the buttocks. All right? Its belly and thighs or buttocks were bronze. Its legs were iron, and its feet were a combination of iron and baked clay. As you watched, a rock was cut from a mountain, but not by human hands. Who do you think could be the rock? What's the name of our church? Who's the cornerstone? All right, a rock is cut out of a mountain, all right? Just kind of giving you a little tidbit. It struck the feet of iron and clay, smashing them to bits. The whole statue was crushed into small pieces of iron, clay, bronze, silver, and gold. Then the wind blew them away without a trace. You couldn't find a piece of it. Wow. Like chaff on a threshing floor. But the rock that knocked the statue down became a great mountain. Now notice this. That covered the whole earth. Now that's the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. And this is a picture of what he saw. We're going to put it up here. It's on the back of your study sheet. This is a picture. Now I'm not saying it looked just like this. The person who drew this, Clarence Larkin, basically what he did is he went back and he looked at some of the things that they had back then and what kings looked like and things that they wore in different empires. But this is probably something like that. And if you notice, the head is what? It's gold. Now we come in and we see the chest and the arms are silver. Then we see that the abdomen, and we can't see but it goes around to the back, is brass. And then we see the legs are iron, and then we get to the feet and the toes. And it's a different substance too. It's made up of a part of the iron. It's made of baked clay and iron for the feet and toes. Now, let's look at the interpretation. Verses 36 through 38. That was the dream. Now, we will tell the king what it means. Now, like he said, we will tell the king. Who's we? Well, God is using Daniel. He wants him to understand it's not I, it's not me, I'm not the big cheese here. You need to understand, We will tell you what it means. But the only reason it's we is because God is the one who has revealed this. So even though I'm speaking, I want you to understand it's God. So now we will tell the king what it means. Your Majesty, you are the greatest of kings, and he's not just flattering him. Not only did he conquer so much, and some of the other empires conquered just as much, but none of them were as wealthy. And the things that we find out as we study that empire, it was unbelievable. All right? He says, you are the greatest of kings. The God of heaven has given you sovereignty, power, strength, and honor. He has made you the ruler over all the inhabited world and has put even the wild animals and birds under your control. You're the head of gold. Now I want you to notice that Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom is represented by the head of gold. So the Babylonian Empire, his kingdom is the head. But here's what's kind of interesting. If the others were making up an interpretation for the dream, if one of the sorcerers had, or the astrologers, or the magicians, I'm sure that the interpretation would have been all about Nebuchadnezzar, and there wouldn't have been anything bad about him. You didn't want to tick the king off. But you know, Daniel's going to tell him the truth. And he wants him to know that your kingdom is not going to remain. Your kingdom is going to go down. And another kingdom is going to take your place. It's going to be replaced. Look at verses 39 through 45. But after your kingdom comes to an end, because it will, King Nebuchadnezzar, another kingdom inferior to yours will rise to take your place. Now, how do we know it's inferior? When we go back to that, if you notice, the chest and the arms are made out of what substance? Silver. Silver's not as valuable as gold. All right? So, inferior to yours will rise to your place. After that kingdom has fallen, yet a third kingdom, represented by bronze, will rise to rule the world. Now, each time the substance changes, it represents a new kingdom. I want you to notice that as we go through this. Following that kingdom, there will be a fourth one, as strong as iron. That kingdom will smash and crush all previous empires, just as iron smashes and crushes everything it strikes. The feet and toes you saw were a combination of iron and baked clay. Now remember, every time we change substances, a new kingdom comes. Now we're changing substances, but we're actually adding something, and there's a piece of the old, which tells us that this kingdom is actually going to disappear, but it's going to be revived. All right? I want you to see that. Now this is showing that this kingdom will be divided like iron mixed with clay. It will have some of the strength of iron, but while some parts of it will be as strong as iron, other parts will be as weak as clay. This mixture of iron and clay also shows that these kingdoms will try to strengthen themselves by forming alliances with each other through intermarriage. But they will not hold together, just as iron and clay do not mix. During the reigns of those kings, what kings? There's 10 toes, 5 toes on each foot. Those toes represent who? Kings. So he says, during the reigns of those kings, the 10 toes, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed or conquered. This tells us when these kings will reign. When are these kings going to reign? It tells us. During the time of the reigns, God is going to set up His kingdom on earth. Now, when is God's kingdom going to be set up on earth? At the end of the tribulation. You're right. That 1,000-year millennial period. It's going to cover the entire earth. That rock's going to come up. It's going to smash every kingdom, all kingdoms. There's not going to be a trace of any man's kingdom, because the kingdom of God's going to come in, and it's going to grow so much it's going to cover the entire earth. But the kingdom of God is going to set up the kingdom that will never be destroyed or conquered. But He tells us when. During the reigns of those kings. So He's going to come at the end of the tribulation, but it's during the reign of those kings. So when are those kings going to reign? They're going to reign during the tribulation. What does that tell us? That the fourth kingdom, which we now know is gone, is going to be revived. It's going to come up. And that kingdom is going to consist of 10 smaller kingdoms. They're going to be a federation of kingdoms. And they're going to rise up, which we're going to find out in just a minute, out of the Roman Empire. That's why you hear all of these prophecy teachers when they're teaching on it. You just never knew why. He talked about the 10 federated kings of the revived Roman Empire is going to bring the Antichrist in or onto the scene. And you hear all that, but you don't know why. Daniel tells us. Let's go further. It will crush. Now what's it? God's kingdom. It will crush all these kingdoms into nothingness, and it will stand forever. That is the meaning of the rock cut from the mountain, though not by human hands, that crushed to pieces the statue of iron, bronze, clay, silver, and gold. The great God was showing the king what will happen in the future. The dream is true. And I'm here to tell you, Nebuchadnezzar, its meaning is certain. And the reason he filled us in on the other 3 kingdoms that really have nothing to do with what we're talking about is because he wanted us to know as we looked back through history that what God said would come to pass came to pass exactly the way he said it would. You remember when we were teaching on the 70 weeks? And God predicted to the very day when Jesus Christ would come in Jerusalem as the Messiah, Palm Sunday. To the very day it was there. And he also said he would be cut off. But not for his own sins, but for us. He was. Everything that he prophesied came to pass to the very day. It's the same way in this dream. Because God wants us to know that he's able to see the future. And he can lay out the future and he tells you exactly what's going to take place. And it does. But the reason he does that is because there are some things that haven't yet come to pass in this dream. That's the part that we're going to focus in on as we go through the book of Revelation. But we must know that the dream is true and its meaning is certain. So, let's kind of recap. The statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw symbolized the 4 great world empires of the ancient world. From the time of Babylon until the time of Christ and a little bit after. Now, the reason all the other empires that have come since the Roman Empire aren't put here is because they have nothing to do with Israel. They have nothing to do with the time of the Gentiles, which Daniel is concerned about. Does that make sense? So we're not going to hear about the British Empire. We're only going to hear about the other or the revived Roman Empire because that has to do with us and that has to do with Israel. And we need to know that. Now, the last empire, as we're going to see, will also disappeared, but it's going to rise again, as I've already said, as a 10-nation federation, and it's going to rise again shortly before the tribulation and in that tribulation. Does that make sense? And the Antichrist will come out of this 10-nation federation. Now, in verse number 38, Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that his empire was the golden head of the statue. But he didn't tell Nebuchadnezzar who the other empires were. Did you notice that? Why? Because Nebuchadnezzar could care less. He only wanted to know what the dream meant in relationship to him. He knew it had something to do with him. And once he heard the dream and once he saw what was taking place, he understood something. Hey, my kingdom's going to disappear, but not in my lifetime. Okay, I'm no longer upset. Good job, Daniel. And guess what he does? He promotes Daniel. And the reason he promotes him is because here's a man that can tell me what it really means. And I know, because I didn't tell him what the dream was, he told me what the dream was. And I remembered, yes, that's exactly what I did dream. And he didn't spare anything. He didn't try to suck up to me. No, he told me exactly what's going to happen. But he didn't care about the other kingdoms. He just wanted to know about him. And that's why the other kingdoms are not told. But we do know who the other empires are, and not just because of history. And we also know what order they would come, and he gave us details about them. And the reason we know that is because Daniel had other visions. And in those visions, he gave more details. In the vision of the ram and the he-goat. How many of you ever heard of the vision of the ram and the he-goat? 1, 2, 3. How many never heard of the vision of the ram and he-goat? How many never read the book of Daniel? It's hard to understand. I understand that. But as I begin to break it down, you're going to find out it's very easy. It's really not that difficult. It's really not that hard to understand. But in the vision of the ram and the he-goat in Daniel chapter 8, we're going to find out who the next 2 kingdoms are. Now, we don't have time to study that vision tonight. We're going to do that next Wednesday night. But I am going to jump ahead. How many of you like to cheat every once in a while? When you're reading a book, you just turn to the end just to make sure it turns out right. Anyone ever do that? Because you don't really want to read the book and find out that was a crappy ending, right? Just kind of depresses me and makes me feel bad. I want something that's going to end good, right? Well, we're going to go through it, but I'm going to kind of jump ahead, and I'm going to at least tell you who the other kingdoms are and in what order they appeared. And then as we go through the vision of the ram and the he-goat and we see some of the other visions, you're going to go, oh my gosh, how did Daniel do that? He didn't. God did. God just told him what was going to take place. So let me do that. After the Babylonian Empire, you had the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medes and the Persians actually formed an alliance, but the Persians were the stronger of the two. They are the ones, this alliance, they were the ones that defeated the Babylonians, and they became the next great world empire. They are represented by the two arms of the statue. Now, when you see the two arms of the statue, the right arm is the Persians, the left arm is the Medes. It's silver, not because it didn't conquer as much land. It's not because they didn't have more people underneath them in servitude. It's because they weren't as wealthy. And a lot of that is because they actually shared it between two, and Nebuchadnezzar didn't do that. Nebuchadnezzar was the sovereign ruler. You know how we know how great his power was? If you've ever read through the book of Daniel, you'll find out that in his pride, God struck him down. And he literally went insane for 7 years. Did you know that? And he ran around thinking that he was an ox. He actually ate the grass, and he would be outside and the dew would come on. And no one in the kingdom acted like anything was wrong. That's how powerful he was. And because he did things like this in the dream, where he would test. See, I really believe that he did remember the dream. That was just a test. They were probably going, he's testing us again. The moment we try to remove him, he's going to pop up and go, gotcha, and we're going to be killed. So people just kind of acted like nothing was strange, nothing was wrong, and he ran around like a beast for 7 years. Did you know that? And immediately, just as God predicted, he came out of it. And he ruled shortly after that, but when he came out of it, he had a whole different attitude. God broke him. And let me tell you, the God of Israel was promoted. He gave place to God. He gave honor to God. All right? Now, when the Medes and Persians formed this alliance, now they had to share the wealth between two. Does that make sense? So their kingdom is silver. The next empire was the Grecian Empire. Daniel even predicted that the Grecian Empire, let me go a little bit further, would be divided into 4 kingdoms. And of course, we know what happened after Alexander the Great died. If you remember, Alexander the Great was unbelievable. He had smaller armies, but he could get to the battle so quick that his enemies could not prepare for him. In fact, it was a different type of warfare. And they were used to, when they would see an enemy coming to attack them, they thought, well, we have plenty of time, and they would start preparing for battle. But when they found out that Alexander the Great was coming, they would come and say, he's coming. They'd start preparing for battle. And before they knew it, he was there. And they were caught surprised. It happened time after time after time. And Alexander the Great just literally went through and, he conquered everyone. And of course, we all know the story. Here he is, a young man, early 30s. And he has no more world or no more countries to conquer. And he's depressed because that's his purpose. And of course, supposedly in his depression, he stays out in the storm and, he gets sick and he dies as a result of sick. But he died shortly in his 30s, about 33. And what's interesting is his kingdom was divided between 4 of his generals. And it happened exactly like Daniel predicted in the vision of the ram and the he-goat. We're going to see that a little bit later, all right? And the 4th great empire, represented by iron, was the Roman Empire. It's represented by iron because the Roman Empire, they reigned with an iron fist. Anyone remember that phrase? I'm telling you, if you stepped out of line, you paid the price. And you can see what they would do. In 70 AD, when they tore Jerusalem down, I mean, they burned the city. They made an example, and the few that ran off to Masada, I mean, everyone else would have said, there's not enough to remain. But no, they had to make an example of everyone. And when Rome was at its strongest, when it's at the pinnacle of its strength, it made sure that if anyone stepped out of line, we made an example of you so you would know. That's why when Jesus was taken outside the city, and if you go to Israel with me, we'll go to the place of the skull. It is, I'm telling you, it's right outside the city walls. We'll turn around and we'll see the old city right there. But you know why they did that? Because everyone who passed by and they saw a person crucified, they said, that's what happens when you come against Rome. Rome ruled with an iron fist. They crushed everyone. And if they were ever defeated, they just sent more troops because they never let it get out that they could be defeated until they got weaker in the years to come. And then, of course, they dissolve. They actually go away too. Anyways, the two legs of the statue represent the Roman Empire. This implied what? You got two legs. What does two legs mean? With the Medo-Persians, one's the Persians, one's the Medes. You got two arms because you have two kings. You have two legs. What does this tell us? That the Roman Empire is going to have a division of two. Did that happen? Well, yes, of course it did. That's exactly what happened. The Roman Empire was divided in two parts in 364 AD. Constantinople was the capital of the Eastern Division, and Rome was the capital of the Western Division. Now, here's what's interesting. The Roman Empire has disappeared. But in the vision, the two legs of the statue has 10 toes. Those 10 toes have never come to fruition. That symbolizes that the Roman Empire is going to eventually divide into 10 kingdoms. And that this Roman Empire is going to be revived. And it's going to consist of these 10 federated kingdoms. And from this future empire, what do we know because of the book of Daniel? The kingdom, if you remember, when we were teaching on the 70 weeks, and it said that this Antichrist is going to do the peace treaty, and then what is he going to do? In the middle of it? Yes, he's going to back out of it. He's going to say, I'm God. He's going to want to be. But here's what's interesting. It tells you the people that he's going to come from. It says, and the people who do this, he comes from the people who do the thing that he predicted in the 70 weeks. That the temple's going to be destroyed. You remember it said the temple's going to be destroyed? The temple was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the Antichrist is going to come up out of the Roman Empire. He's going to come out of the 10 toes that's in this statue. Does that make sense? All right. And of course, Daniel tells us he's going to make a peace treaty with Israel. He's going to allow them to rebuild the temple. And that's the first seal. But here's what most people don't realize. When the Antichrist first comes on the scene, not every nation's going to back him. And most of you have been taught that, haven't you? There's going to be some nations that's going to challenge him. There's going to be some nations that's going to form an alliance, and Russia is going to head it. His leader is referred to as Gog. The country that he leads is who? Magog. Right? And he's going to form an alliance, and we're going to look at all of the nations that he forms an alliance with. And guess what? They are going to attack Israel. They're not going to attack the Antichrist. They're going to attack Israel. Why? Because it's at the very beginning of the tribulation. It is now the second seal when the nuclear war takes place. Does that make sense? But we don't want to study World War III until you understand the nations that are involved. Because if you don't understand the nations that are involved and you don't understand the details, guess what? It's just something that you've memorized, something that you learned in school and you don't really understand, but you know the right answer. We don't want to do that. By the time we get through the book of Revelation, you're going to understand it if you come regularly. If you go home and you listen and you study, I promise you, by the time we get through the book of Revelation, you go, boy, that is not what everyone told me. That is not too hard to understand. we can understand that and we can see what's going to happen. I'm not going to say simple because you have to think, but it is not too difficult, and I'll tell you why. Because God is the one who has revealed it. But He makes us study to understand it. Last week we studied Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And if you remember, Nebuchadnezzar, let's see if I can get that right. Oh, Neb, how's that? Oh, Neb had a dream. And the dream troubled him. It troubled him so much that he called for the magicians, the sorcerers, the astrologers, and the Chaldeans. And he called them into his chamber. And he told them that he wanted them to interpret the dream. But not just to interpret the dream, he wanted them to tell him what he had dreamed because he forgot what he had dreamed. Or at least that's what the King James Version seems to imply. Look at verse number 5. In verse number 5 it says, the dream was gone from him. In other words, he couldn't remember it. So he demanded that they not only interpret his dream, but they also reveal to him what he had dreamed. Now, I don't know if he really forgot what he had dreamed or if he was just testing them to see if they could really interpret the dream. But one thing is for sure. He wanted them to tell him what the dream was and to interpret the dream. And if they couldn't do it, he was going to execute them. And guess what? They said, this is impossible. No one can do this. So Nebuchadnezzar said, all right, then all the astrologers, all the sorcerers, all the magicians, all the Chaldeans are going to be put to death. Now, what's interesting is that Daniel wasn't with them, even though he belonged to the group known as the Chaldeans. So when they came to get Daniel, and not just Daniel, they came to get Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to execute them. Daniel told the person who came to get them, hey, go tell the king that if he'll give me just a little bit of time, I'll be able to tell him what he had dreamed, and I'll be able to tell him the interpretation of the dream. So they did. They gave him a little bit of time to pray and to seek God's face. And of course, what did God do? He honored that because Daniel was a man of God. And He gave unto him a vision of what Nebuchadnezzar had dreamed. And God also revealed the interpretation of the dream. So when Daniel went to the king, he revealed the dream. And in the dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw a huge statue of a man. The head of the statue was made of gold. The chest and arms were of silver. The belly and thighs were bronze. The legs were iron, and the feet were a combination of iron and baked clay. And as Nebuchadnezzar was looking at the statue, a rock was cut from a mountain, and it struck the feet, and it bashed it or smashed it into pieces, and the statue just kind of crumbled and fell into all these different pieces. And then this great wind came, and it blew it all away until there was nothing left. Then the rock became a great mountain, and it spread over the entire earth. Now, that's the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, and this is a picture of what he saw in the dream. Now, the reason we think this is what he saw is because Clarence Larkin did a lot of study, and he went back to the type of statues they made in this period, and this is probably what it looked like. We don't know for sure, but it looked something like this. And then Daniel interpreted the dream. The head of gold represented the Babylonian Empire. But Nebuchadnezzar's empire wasn't going to remain forever. It was going to be conquered. It was eventually going to be replaced by another empire. And eventually that empire would also fall, and another empire would take its place. Then that empire was going to fall, and another would take its place. The fourth and final kingdom would eventually fall away. But it would be revived in the last days, and it would be made up of a 10-nation confederacy. The Antichrist is going to be the head of this 10-nation confederacy. But we're not to be dismayed, because during the reign of those 10 kings, Christ is going to return. And He is going to set up His kingdom upon this earth, and His kingdom is going to last forever. Now, this kingdom is going to be set up physically upon the earth for a period of 1,000 years. That's why it's referred to as the millennium. And then after that, there's going to be a judgment. We're going to see that. There's going to be a great judgment on the earth. And so the heaven and the earth is going to pass away. There's going to be a new heaven, new earth. But Christ's kingdom is going to be established and will last forever. Look at Daniel chapter 2, verse number 44. During the reign of those kings, what kings is he referring to? The 10 toes. The God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed or conquered. It will crush all these kingdoms into nothingness and will stand forever. That's the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. But Daniel didn't tell Nebuchadnezzar or us who the second empire would be, or the third, or the fourth. How do we know that this is, we know it's the Babylonian Empire because he told us that, but he didn't tell us what the next empire would be. How do we know it's the Medo-Persian Empire? How did we know that the next one would be the Grecian Empire? How did we know that the next one would be the Roman Empire? Because he didn't tell us. Oh, yes, he did. If you keep reading the book of Daniel, you find out who the other empires are and in what order they came. Because Daniel had other visions. And in those visions, God is going to fill in the blanks. It's one of those things that you come upon it and you say, oh, okay, he's given us this much information, but now there's a lot of questions. Well, you just have to keep reading because he's going to answer those questions. And in the vision of the ram and the he-goat in Daniel chapter 8, we find out who the next two kingdoms are. So tonight, we're going to be studying that vision, the vision of the ram and the he-goat. So turn to Daniel chapter 8. We're going to look at the first two verses. It says, during the third year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, saw another vision. Now, we're going to have to work backwards next week, but I'm doing this in a specific order, and you're going to find out why next week. He also had a vision of the four wild beasts, and we're going to look at that next week. But I want you to understand when he says, I, Daniel, saw another vision, he's not referring to Nebuchadnezzar's dream and the vision he had of that dream. He's referring to the vision of the four wild beasts. And he said, I saw another vision following the one that had already appeared to me. In this vision, I was at the fortress of Susa, in the province of Elam, standing beside the Ulai River. Now, let's put this in some kind of time frame, if you don't mind. Because many times we just kind of lump that all together and say, oh, that's Old Testament. But you need to understand the timeline here. Nebuchadnezzar's dream occurred sometime around 603 BC, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. At that time, Daniel would have been a very, very young man. Scholars estimate that Daniel was about 23 years old at that time. Can you imagine being 23 years old and you save all of the wise men? Because you have such a relationship with God that when you start praying, God gives you a vision of a man's dream and then gives you the interpretation. But that's how old Daniel was. That's why the New Testament tells us not to despise our youth. We're not to look at our youth if we're young, and I'm not there anymore. But when I was young, we were not supposed to despise our youth because God doesn't look upon age in the way we do. If someone has a heart for God, he's going to bless them. He's going to anoint them. And that's what happened to Daniel. Now, the vision of the ram and the he-goat occurred around 538 BC, the third year of Belshazzar's reign. That's about 65 years after Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So Daniel was about 88 years old when he had this vision. He was an old man. In fact, what's kind of interesting, after this vision, he literally gets sick. He's exhausted. His body is not to the point where he can stay out all night and get up early in the morning and still go to work. So after he has this vision, and we won't see that, so I'm kind of giving you a little preview when you go back and read this. After the vision, he's done all of this. He's totally exhausted. And then it says he was sick for several days. Why? Because he's an old man at this time. Now, notice that in the vision, Daniel was at the fortress of Susa, standing beside the Ulai River. In other words, in the vision, Daniel was translated to the future capital of Persia, which is Susa. The word translated means to transfer from one place to another. That's no problem for God. We see it in the New Testament. We see one of the people in the New Testament, he's ministering, and all of a sudden he's translated somewhere else. God can do that. We see when Jesus was resurrected, he was translated from one place to another. Well, in this vision, I don't believe that Daniel was physically translated, but in the vision, he was translated to the future capital of Persia. Now, in the vision, when he was translated to Susa, that's in modern day Iran. Susa is about 225 miles due east of Babylon, and as I have already mentioned, it was going to be the future capital of Persia. So he's literally going to see this take place, but he's at the place where the next kingdom's going to come from. Now, in the vision, Daniel saw a ram with two horns next to the river. One horn was higher than the other. Now, remember what horns represent. Does everyone remember what horns represent? Kings. Yes, strength and power, but when it's in these visions, horns represent kings. One horn was higher than the other, and the ram pushed westward, northward, and southward, and no beast could stand before it. So the ram with two horns became very great. The two kings became very great. And as Daniel was considering the ram with two horns, a he-goat came from the west, and his feet didn't touch the ground. Now, what does he mean his feet didn't touch the ground? Well, that's a figure of speech that means he moved very, very fast. He ran so fast that you couldn't see his feet touching the ground. Anyone ever said that? Man, he was running so fast, his feet weren't even touching the ground. No, his feet were touching the ground. It just didn't seem like they were. And this goat had one large horn between his eyes. And he charged the ram with two horns, and he hit the ram, and he broke the ram's two horns. And he knocked the ram to the ground, and he stamped on the ram until he killed it. And the he-goat became very great. And when the goat was at the peak of his strength, the great horn was broken. Now, what does a horn represent? A king. And up came four horns. And the four horns went toward the four winds of the heaven. In other words, one horn went towards the north, one king did. One horn went to the south, another to the east, and another to the west. And out of one of the horns came this little horn. And the little horn became very great. And it went towards the south. Now, whenever in the Old Testament you see towards the south, it usually refers to Egypt. All right? Egypt is really the only nation around that area that they ever went to conquer. They didn't go any further into Africa. They just usually went to Egypt. And then it says it went towards the east. In other words, towards modern-day Iraq and Iran, where the Medo-Persian Empire was and where the Babylonian Empire had been. And it says towards the pleasant land. Now, what is the pleasant land? Anyone ever heard that phrase? The pleasant land is Israel. And it says it grew so strong that it attacked the host of heaven. And it cast down some of the stars and it trampled upon them. Now, we usually don't understand this because we're not familiar with symbols. We're not familiar with Hebrewisms and figures of speech. But if you're familiar with those Hebrewisms, it's not a problem. So let me just kind of explain a few things. The phrase host of heaven is a figure of speech that refers to the residents of heaven. In other words, God's people. Stars in the Old Testament symbolized either angels or who? Jews. Why? Well, if you remember, God told Abraham that his descendants were going to be as numerous as what? The stars in the sky. So in the Old Testament, whenever you saw stars, if it didn't refer to them literally, it usually either referred to angels, because they're like the stars in the sky too, they're numerous, or it referred to the Jews. And the little horn exalted itself to the point that it challenged God by taking away the daily sacrifices in the temple. Now, that was the vision that Daniel had of the ram and the he-goat. You'll find that in chapter 8, verses 1 through 12. I decided to tell you about the vision rather than read it. It seems like when I read a lot of scripture, people kind of zone out. Do you do that? So I thought if I would tell it instead of read it, then you would maybe hang with me. But if you want to go back and read it, you can read it for yourself in chapter 8, verses 1 through 12. Now let's look at the interpretation. And as we look at the interpretation, we're going to go through the scripture verse by verse. All right? Let's read verses 16 through 26 so you get an overview of it. Then we're going to break it down. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Uli, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. Who do you think Gabriel is? Yeah, the archangel. Whenever a message needs to be sent, who do they send? Good old Gabriel. So he came near to where I was standing. When he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. What we're studying the end times. Now, while he was talking with me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. What What do you think that means? Ever heard the term slain in the Spirit? Probably slain in the Spirit. Scared to death. Okay, just like the Romans, when the angel came, rolled away the stone, Jesus was resurrected, they fell down like dead men, all right? This is Daniel. But he touched me and he made me stand upright. He made him. He forced him, is what the Hebrew says. And he said, behold, I am going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation. For it pertains to the appointed time of the what? The end. The ram which you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. And the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. And the large horn that is between his eye is the first king. And the broken horn and the four horns that rose in his place represent four kingdoms which will arise from his nation. Whose nation? The first king's nation, although not with his power. In other words, they're not going to be as strong. That's why it's divided between four. And in the latter period of their rule, whose rule? The four kings. All right? When the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise. Now this is very important. We're going to see this in just a little bit. Insolent and skilled in intrigue. And his power will be not mighty, but not by his own power. And he will destroy to an extraordinary degree and prosper and perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people. And through his shrewdness he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. And he will magnify himself in his heart. And he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes. Wow. Who's the prince of princes? Well, yeah. But he will be broken without human agency. And the vision of the evenings and mornings which have been told is true. But keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. Now, let's go through this passage of Scripture and let's see how it applies to Nebuchadnezzar's dream and to the end times. Because when we're going through the book of Revelation, there's many times we're going to refer back to the book of Daniel. And if you don't understand the book of Daniel, it's going to seem like, that's just a mess in Revelation. But it's not. And I'm going to make this so simple that anyone can understand it. You might have to go home, look at the notes again. You might even have to get on the internet and listen to the sermon again. But you can understand this. All right? First of all, notice in verse 16 that it's Gabriel, the archangel, that's explaining the vision. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Ulai, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. You know what I like about God? He doesn't want to keep us shrouded in mystery. He doesn't want us to go around in ignorance. God wants us to know. That's why our ministry is more of a teaching ministry. The reason we're going to be teaching on marriage is because God doesn't want you to have a bad marriage. He wants you to have a good marriage. But let me tell you, the key to a good marriage is knowledge. Jesus said you shall know the truth, and the truth shall do what? Set you free. But if you don't know the truth, you're going to always be in bondage. Now, it's up to you whether you apply the truth, but God doesn't want you to be shrouded in mystery or in ignorance. And so he tells Gabriel, tell this man, give this man some understanding. Now, let's look at the interpretation that Gabriel gave to Daniel. The ram with two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. Look at verse number 20. The ram which you saw with the two horns represents the king of Media and Persia. Now, in Daniel's vision, the ram pushed northward, westward, and southward, and nothing could stand in its way. In other words, it became the ruling empire of the known world. This empire corresponds to the silver chest and the arms of the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So when I told you last week, just to fill this in, can we go back to the statue? I told you to write across here, Medo-Persian Empire. How do we know that's the Medo-Persian Empire? Because in the future vision of the ram and the he-goat, he tells us. All right? The right arm represents the Persians because they were the stronger of the two. That's also why one horn of the ram was higher than the other. Their empire was represented by silver because their empire wasn't as wealthy as the Babylonian Empire. Why? What do you think that is? I told you last week. Do you remember? It's because you don't have one king. Now you have two kingdoms that's in an alliance. So now the wealth of the empire has to be spread between two. So it's no longer gold, it's silver. Now what's interesting is that the emblem of Persia at the time was a ram. Its coins had a ram's head on one side, and it had a ram that was resting on the other side. Not only that, but the Persian king would ride before his army wearing a golden ram's head as a crown. How many of you have ever seen pictures of Persia and you would see the king coming out and what would be on his head? A ram's head, and it was golden. He didn't have a crown like others. Why? Because the ram represented the Persians. Very interesting. The he-goat with the one great horn between its eyes represents Greece. How do we know that? Look at verse 21. And the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Who was the first king of the Grecian Empire? Alexander the Great. And Daniel's vision, it didn't touch the ground, or its feet didn't touch the ground. In other words, Alexander the Great's army moved so quickly you couldn't see it moving. It was there before you knew it. You see, no army before Alexander the Great could mobilize and move so quickly. They were very slow. Before Alexander the Great, when one army or one nation moved against another nation, you had plenty of time to prepare for battle because the armies moved slowly. It took a lot of time to move these armies, but not Alexander the Great's army. He moved his army and he attacked before anyone could prepare. In fact, when messengers would be sent and they would say, Alexander the Great, or they didn't call him that, but they would say, Greece is coming. And they would say, okay, we need to prepare. And before you knew it, they were already there. They were right behind the messengers. That's why his smaller army defeated greater armies. According to Clarence Larkin, with an army of 30,000 men and 5,000 cavalry men, he defeated the Persian army of 600,000 men commanded by Darius. Now, around here you hear it Darius, but that's because we're from Cherokee County. But it's really Darius, all right? He fought the Persians one more time at the Tigris River, and he annihilated them, although they had almost 10 times as many men. How could he do that? Well, first of all, he was very strategic. Even though he was very, very young, he understood warfare. And when he was a child, he had been tutored by the best. In fact, you can go back and look at the great Greek philosopher that actually tutored him. But what's interesting about him is he knew how to take the landscape. And he would actually get to the battlefield before anyone else. And he would actually set up the battle the way he wanted to go. And he'd pull them in, and then he would be able to take control of it. And his smaller army would literally annihilate the enemy. But Alexander didn't reign long. He became king in 336 BC at the age of 20, and he died in 323 BC at the age of 33. It's kind of sad, isn't it? Here's Alexander the Great, and he's dead by the age of 33. His empire was the third world empire in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and it's represented by the bronze belly, and I told you the thighs and the gluteus maximus. So right here it says brass, but actually bronze, that's who? That's Greece. We know that because of this vision. Now, I'd like to go into greater detail at this time, if you don't mind. And I think it's going to be interesting to you. It's one of those little things that, it's not really going to affect what we believe when it comes to the end times. But it's really an interesting little fact that God puts in there. So let's go into a little more detail. Notice in verse number 6 that the he-goat charged the ram in a great rage. Notice what it says. He came toward the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal, and he charged him in a great rage. In fact, in the very next verse, it talks about furiously battling him. Do you realize that Alexander the Great's war with Persia was personal? He had a vendetta. He wasn't just going to defeat Persia, he was going to annihilate them. You see, in 480 BC, Persia invaded Greece. At the pass of Thermopylae, a small force that was led by the king of Sparta held off the Persians for 3 days. The Spartans were eventually betrayed by one of their own who showed the Persians a path that led behind the Greek lines. In fact, the movie The 300 is actually based upon that. They've taken a lot of liberties, but how many have seen The 300? They came in there and literally held them off at this pass until they went behind them. They wouldn't have been able to hold them off forever, but they did for a while. But it was the Battle of Thermopylae that supposedly caused Alexander the Great to hate the Persians. And it's why he attacked them with the great rage. It was personal to him. He didn't just want to defeat them. He wanted to annihilate them and to destroy their kingdoms. Now, after Alexander the Great died, his kingdom was divided among 4 of his generals. Cassander, who took Macedonia in the western part of Alexander the Great's empire. Lysimachus, who took Thrace in the northern part of the empire. And Seleucus, who took Syria in the eastern part. And Ptolemy, who took Egypt in the southern part. Now, this is exactly what Daniel saw in his vision. This is why liberals read the book of Daniel and they go, Daniel could not have been written when they say it was, because no one could have predicted this as accurately as he did. But Daniel did, because God knows the future. Look at Daniel 8:8. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, his large horn was broken off. Now, a horn represents a king, right? Who was the first king? Alexander the Great. So at the height of his power, at the peak of his strength, 33 years old, Alexander the Great dies. Now, there's a lot of theories of what he died of. Some even think he was poisoned. Others said, he got drunk, and as a result of this, he laid out in the rain, and he was sick. He caught malaria. Doesn't matter. At 33 years of age, at the height of his power, the horn was broken off. He died. And in its place, 4 prominent horns. What are horns? Kings. 4 prominent kings grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And guess what? They divided the kingdom just like Daniel said they would. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Out of one of the 4 horns, a little horn came up and it grew very large. Now, it says a little horn. What's a horn? A king. A little king is going to come up out of one of the 4 horns. And it grew towards the south, the east, and the glorious land. The glorious land, again, I told you, is just another name for Israel. Look at verse number 9. Out of one of them, that's referring to, what is them? Those 4 horns. Out of one of the 4 horns came another horn, which started small, but it grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. The little horn was Antiochus Epiphanes. Anyone ever heard of Antiochus Epiphanes? Antiochus began strengthening his kingdom by pushing to the east and to the south, just like Daniel predicted. He invaded Egypt, and he overran it except for Alexandria. Now, while he was marching with his army to Alexandria, they'd already taken the small island of Cyprus, a messenger of Rome was sent. And you need to understand, Rome was not the Roman Empire yet. It was coming up. We're going to find out a little bit later after this. It does defeat them, and it becomes the 4th and the last great empire in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. But at this point, it's still coming up in its power, but it's strong enough to make threats. So what happened is his army was marching towards Alexandria. A messenger of Rome met him and told him that he must immediately withdraw from Egypt and Cyprus. And Antiochus told him he would discuss it with his council. So guess what the messenger did? The messenger took out a sword and he drew a circle around Antiochus and he said this, "Before you cross the circle, I want you to give an answer to the Senate of Rome." What he was implying was that if he stepped out of the circle without agreeing to what Rome said, Rome would immediately declare war upon him. So he withdrew in humiliation. This spread. Everyone heard about it. And he was humiliated. But he also knew he couldn't stand up against Rome. And everything that he had worked for, everything that he had conquered would be gone if he went against Rome. So he withdrew in humiliation. Now, guess whose land he had to cross when he was going home, and who he would take his wrath out on as he was going home? You got it. Israel. In his fury, he did the following when he came to Israel. He plundered Jerusalem. He outlawed the Jewish religion and replaced it with Greek worship. He outlawed the observance of the Sabbath. He outlawed circumcision. He outlawed the reading of the scriptures. He burned whatever scriptures he found. He sacrificed a pig on the altar at the temple. He set up an idol in the temple. He compelled idol worship around all the other cities around Jerusalem. He claimed he was God manifested in the flesh, and he demanded to be worshiped as God. In a sense, he attacked God. And Daniel saw all of this in his vision. This is why, again, liberals read this and they go, there is no way. Notice what Daniel saw in verses 9 through 12 and the interpretation. And out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south and toward the east and toward the beautiful land. And it grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the hosts and some of the stars to fall to the earth. Now, it grew up to the host of heaven. Didn't mean it grew up this way. The host of heaven represents who? Residents of heaven, which are God's people. So it grew up to God's people. It grew all the way to Israel. And in the beginning, he was peaceful with Israel. He passed through Israel's land to go to Egypt. He had a peace treaty with Israel. He wasn't going to touch them. Does that make sense? And he caused some of the hosts and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and he trampled them down. So what did he do? He grabbed some of the stars. He compelled them to worship. They actually fell. But then he killed and slaughtered and murdered so many. He even magnified himself to be equal with the commander of the host. Who is the commander of the children of God? Jesus. But at this point, it's the Old Testament. So it's the Lord of hosts is what he would be referred to. And so he magnified himself to be equal to God. And he removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice. And it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. Now this is very, very important. It's a very important vision, because Antiochus Epiphanes is a type of the Antichrist. In other words, what Antiochus Epiphanes did is exactly what the Antichrist is going to do during the tribulation, because Antiochus is a type of the Antichrist. Does that make sense? Now, let me prove that to you. It's easy for me to say that, but I can prove it to you in the Scriptures. Notice in verse 16 and 17 that Gabriel tells Daniel that the vision has to do with the end times. Look at verse 16 and 17. And I heard the voice of man between the banks of Uli, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man understanding of the vision. So Gabriel came near to where I was standing. When he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. In other words, what? The end times. So the vision of the ram, the he-goat, has to do with when? The end times. Now, if that's the case, you would naturally expect the fourth and the last empire to be mentioned in this vision. Right? Look at the slide. This is Babylon. This is the Medo-Persian Empire. This is Greece. Was Rome even mentioned in this vision? No. Now Gabriel comes on the scene. He says, this vision has to do with the end times. Well, let's be honest. Even Rome doesn't have anything to do with the end times. The revived Roman Empire does. We're going to find out next week that there's actually a gap here. What do you think that gap is? The church age. We studied the church age. We have come to the end of the church age, and any time the rapture can occur. When that rapture occurs, guess what? The revived Roman Empire will be there. The 10 kings are going to be in there. And during the reign of the 10 kings, it says, that's when Christ will return. So what's interesting is this empire is what's going to be at the end times. But these two empires aren't even mentioned in that. So you would think if this vision has to do with the end times, like Gabriel said, Rome would be mentioned, right? But it's not. Why? Why is it not mentioned? Because the little horn that rises out of the four horns of the third empire is not the Antichrist. The little horn is the type of the Antichrist. You see, Moses was a type of who? Jesus. Moses went down to Egypt and his people were in bondage. He led the people of Israel out of bondage, supposedly to the promised land, but there was a gap of time before they went to the promised land. Remember that? And it also says when they came through I always want to say Red River. It's a problem of living in Oklahoma. The Red Sea, they were baptized into Moses, what it says. So Moses was a type of Jesus Christ. And we can look back and see what Moses did, and we can go and look and see what Jesus did, and we can realize Moses was a type of Jesus. But just as Moses was a type of Jesus, guess what? Antiochus Epiphanes is a type of the Antichrist. And so just as Jesus could go through the scriptures and prove he was the Messiah when they were on the road to Emmaus and go back and prove all of that, guess what? We can look at Antiochus Epiphanes and we can see, because in the book of Revelation, another little horn is going to rise up. But it's not going to rise up out of the four kings or the four horns. It's going to rise up, according to John, out of the 10 horns that's on the beast. Why is it a little horn and how does it become very great? Well, now we go back to Antiochus. So that tells us that what Antiochus Epiphanes did to Israel is the same thing that the Antichrist is going to do to Israel during the tribulation. Just as Antiochus Epiphanes had a peace treaty with Israel to go through them when they went to attack Egypt, and then he broke it. So the Antichrist, Daniel tells us, and we see that in Daniel chapter 9, is going to create this peace treaty. He's going to allow them to rebuild the temple. And guess what he's going to do? He's going to go into the temple after 3.5 years, and he's going to say, I am God, worship me. And that's the abomination of desolation. But that's the second abomination of desolation. The first abomination of desolation happened when Antiochus Epiphanes came back and broke the peace treaty, went into the temple, slew the pig, and then said, I am God, worship me. So why does he say this is the end times? Because he's saying this is a picture of what's going to happen. But it's not going to happen until the end time. But you can see all of the things that the Antichrist is going to do. So let's do a quick little recap so you understand what I'm saying. The ram with 2 horns represents the Medo-Persian Empire. The he-goat represents the Grecian Empire. It attacked and killed the Medo-Persian Empire. The first king of the Grecian Empire was Alexander the Great. When he died, the kingdom was divided among 4 generals. The vision predicted that out of one of the 4 horns, a little horn would come. The little horn would grow very strong and, after a peace treaty, would wage war on God's children. And he would end the sacrifices at the temple, declaring himself to be God and demanding to be worshipped. That man fulfilled it was Antiochus Epiphanes. He is a type of the Antichrist. That's why this vision is so important. Because the things that Antiochus Epiphanes did is exactly what the Antichrist is going to do as we read through the book of Revelation. That's why scholars apply these scriptures to the Antichrist. So many times you'll be reading through this, Daniel chapter 8, and you'll go, well, wait a minute. They're saying that the Antichrist is going to do that. How can scholars do that? Scholars do that because they recognize that Antiochus Epiphanes is simply a type of what the Antichrist is going to be. Now, next week, we're going to look at one more vision, and then we're going to go back to Revelation. That vision is the vision of the 4 wild beasts. When we finish that vision, we're going to go back to the second seal. Now, when we get to the second seal, we're going to have to go into Ezekiel chapter 37, 38, and 39. But I promise you, once we finish Ezekiel, we're going to stay in the book of Revelation, except for every once in a while referring back. But Revelation is going to make so much more sense because you understand Daniel. The book of Daniel is divided into 2 sections, historical and prophetical. Chapters 1 through 6 are historical. Chapters 7 through 12 are prophetical. Now, because the book of Daniel is divided this way, it's not in chronological order. Now, for us in the Western Hemisphere, that really throws us off. Because whenever we read something, we want to read it in chronological order. So when we're reading things in the Bible, we just naturally assume that they're recording events that happened in chronological order. But the Jewish mind didn't work that way. They had the tendency to group things according to subject. In fact, that's the way it is in the New Testament. So when you're reading through the Gospels and you think, well, Jesus was here and the very next day he was here and then right after that. No, it's not that way. Many times they group things according to subject. So I need you to understand that Daniel is divided in a way that's not chronological order. It's divided in a way where it shows all the historical events and then it goes to the prophetical part. But that's not a problem. It's really easy to tell where each chapter fits chronologically. It's easy because the first verse in each chapter lets you know where it fits chronologically. The visions found in chapter 7 through 12 were all received after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. So the whole prophetical section, chapter 7 through 12, it happened after Nebuchadnezzar died. Chronologically, though, chapter 7 and 8 took place, I should say, because it's past tense, before chapter 5. Now, for those of you who have never read the book of Daniel, or who haven't studied Daniel before, chapter 5 is all about the handwriting on the wall. Hopefully you grew up in Sunday school, and maybe your Sunday school teacher told you about this story, about Belshazzar. Belshazzar was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He was the prince at the time, and the reason why I say prince is because his father was also reigning. But there was a period of 3 years in which they reigned together. And so you had his father who was the king, and Belshazzar was the prince. Now most people don't understand that, but when we get to the end of the story, it kind of makes sense, because when Daniel comes in, and he's able to explain what the handwriting on the wall is, he tells him that he's going to make him third in line in the kingdom. And you think, third in line, well, who's number 2? Well, Belshazzar was number 2. But let me tell you a little bit about the story of the handwriting on the wall. The Medes and the Persians were attacking Babylon. And Belshazzar's father, Nabonidus, went out to fight them, and he was defeated. So now Babylon was under siege by Cyrus. But Belshazzar didn't seem to be worked up at all. Didn't seem to be upset about it. And the reason he wasn't upset is because he had been told that he was safe inside the walls of the fortress. And as a result of that, he believed it. And to show everyone how unafraid he was and how confident he was that they weren't going to be able to get in, he actually threw this large party. And he invited 1,000 nobles to come. Now, while he was drinking wine, this seems like the more wine that he drank, the happier he got and the more confident he became. So as he was drinking some of the wine, he decided that, we're going to drink out of the golden and the silver goblets that had been taken out of the temple by his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar. Do you remember when Nebuchadnezzar went in and he actually laid siege against Jerusalem? And there was actually 3 periods of captivity, took them out. But the last one, he actually destroyed the temple and took everything from the temple to Babylon. Now, he called for all of the silver and gold goblets to be brought to the party. And so they were all drinking out of this, in a sense mocking God. And suddenly, this human hand appears, and it wrote on the plaster of the wall. You find that in verse number 5 of chapter 5. Now, of course, this scared Belshazzar and everyone else to death. So what did he do? He called for all the wise men to come and tell him what it said. What are these words that are written on the wall? This has to be by God. What does it mean? Now, all of these wise men came in. It was just kind of like Nebuchadnezzar's dream. They couldn't interpret. They didn't know what it meant. And someone said, no, wait a minute. I remember that there was this man during your grandfather's reign who was able to not only interpret his dream, but to actually tell him what he dreamed. This man's still in the kingdom. Now, what most people don't understand is that Daniel, in a sense, had been retired for 23 years. He was a bigwig in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. But when Nebuchadnezzar died, he kind of drifted out of the scene. And all he was really doing was seeking God's face and studying the law. In fact, as he was reading through the book of Jeremiah, that's when he realized how long the captivity would take place and what all God was going to do. So someone remembered about Daniel, and they said, let's call him in. So Daniel comes in. And sure enough, he's able to read the writing on the wall. It said this, 3 words, Mene, which means God has numbered the days of your reign, and he has brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. And Perez, which means, therefore your kingdom is divided, and it's given to the Medes and the Persians. And of course, verse number 30 tells us that very night, Belshazzar was slain because they diverted the river that ran underneath it, and they were able to actually come inside the fortress, and they conquered the Babylonians. So the vision we're going to study tonight was received before this happened. The Medes and the Persians are not in power. In fact, they don't see it coming yet because this is actually about 3 years before that time. All right? Now, chapters 9 through 12, they're going to take place after chapter 5. In other words, they take place during the reign of the Medo-Persian Empire. Does that make sense? Well, let me tell you what I did. I put a timeline on the back of your handout to help you. So if you kind of want to know how the events happened in chronological order, how old Daniel was, all you have to do is look at that timeline, and hopefully you can put it together. Is that going to help? Good. You can look at that later. We're going to move on. Tonight, we're going to study the vision of the 4 wild beasts found in chapter 7. But before we look at it, I need to explain a few things. The vision of the 4 wild beasts corresponds to the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had in chapter 2. We've spent a lot of time on this dream. But the reason we've spent a lot of time on this dream is because so many of the visions that Daniel had corresponds to that dream. Does that make sense? Now, in the dream, and I'm going to review because you really need to understand this because everything hinges on it. In the dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw this huge statue of a man. The head of the statue was gold. The chest and arms were silver. The belly and not the thighs, the belly and the actually buttocks, but that's a little crass, I guess they would say. So we used the thighs in its place because we thought that was better. It's more of a euphemism. But the belly and the buttocks were bronze. The legs were iron, and the feet were a combination of iron and baked clay. And as Nebuchadnezzar was looking at the statue, this rock was cut from a mountain, but not with human hands. And the rock came and it smashed the feet of clay and iron, and it smashed it to bits. And the whole statue just kind of crumbled, and the wind blew it all away. And then this rock grew into this great mountain until it covered the entire earth. That was Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And then Daniel went further and he interpreted the dream to Nebuchadnezzar. He told him that the head of gold represented the Babylonian Empire. But he said, your empire will not last forever. Eventually it's going to fall. And it's going to be replaced by the Medo-Persian Empire. And it's going to reign a while, but even it eventually is going to fall. And the reason it's going to fall is because another empire is going to rise, the Grecian Empire. And the Grecian Empire is going to take its place. And of course, that's represented by the bronze part of the statue. And then the Grecian Empire is going to fall, and the Roman Empire is going to take its place, which is represented by the legs of iron. And finally, even the Roman Empire, the 4th empire and the last empire, is going to fall. But in the last days, it's going to be revived. And it's going to be made up of a 10-nation confederacy. And during the reign of those 10 kings, Christ is going to return. He's going to set up his kingdom upon the earth, and his kingdom is going to last forever. Now, that's the basics of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And you need to remember that, because all of the other visions seem to go back to that. Does that make sense? Last week we looked at the we looked at the vision of the ram and the he-goat. And remember, that filled in the blanks to Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Well, this vision is also going to correspond to the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had in chapter 2. Now, some of you might be wondering why Daniel would have another vision of basically the same thing. Well, there's actually 3 reasons for this. And if you're taking notes, hopefully you're going to write this down and add a little bit more than what we've given you. First of all, these visions are, and remember, Daniel had a vision of the dream. So the dream and the vision are from 2 different perspectives. Nebuchadnezzar's dream is from man's perspective. You see, from man's perspective, a kingdom represents wealth, majesty, and power. But some kingdoms are wealthier than others. And some kingdoms are more powerful than others, or stronger than others, which is also true of different metals. Some metals are more valuable than others, and some metals are stronger than others. So the different metals in Nebuchadnezzar's dream represented different kingdoms. The Babylonian Empire was what? It was of gold. And the Medo-Persian Empire was represented by silver. And the Grecian Empire was represented by bronze. And the Roman Empire was represented by iron. And Nebuchadnezzar could relate to that, especially since he represented the head of gold. Does that make sense? But Nebuchadnezzar could relate to that. In fact, if you go back to that time period, and especially if you go to Egypt and back to Babylon during that time, they were big into making these majestic palaces. And they would make these huge statues. In fact, in 2 weeks, we also went to Egypt. So I'm going to show you some of the statues that we saw. We went to the Cheops pyramids. We saw the Sphinx. We saw some of the other things. And those who went on to Luxor, they saw not only the palace, but they saw the temples that the Egyptians had. And guess what's interesting? You would have all of these huge statues. So what Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream was something that he was very used to, and it made a lot of sense to him. Does that make sense? On the other hand, the vision of the 4 wild beasts is from God's perspective. From God's perspective, these 4 kingdoms are like wild beasts devouring one another. He sees them as bestial in character, maintaining their supremacy by brute force. Think about this. The lion devours its prey. In fact, sometimes the lion will actually kill something and play with it. How many of you have ever seen a cat catch a mouse, but the mouse is still alive and it just plays with it? You know what's kind of interesting? Cats will do that. Lions will do that. To teach their young how to hunt, they might semi-kill it and put it there, but they let the young come in and begin to prowl on it and do all of this. But they'll devour its prey. The bear, it crushes its prey. The leopard springs upon its victims, and believe it or not, it sucks its blood. And the 4th beast can't even be described by a wild animal because there's nothing like it in nature. So this vision of the 4 wild beasts is from God's perspective. So one of the reasons that Daniel sees a vision that corresponds to Nebuchadnezzar's dream is because God wants Daniel to understand that the first vision he had of Nebuchadnezzar's dream is from man's perspective, the way man sees it. But now he's going to give him a vision of the very same thing, but he wants him to know this is from God's perspective. So that's the first reason he gives him a vision of the very same thing. Secondly, the vision of the 4 wild beasts goes much more in depth than Daniel's vision of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. When we get to verses 9 through 14, you're going to see what I mean. This vision is very similar to the vision that John had in the book of Revelation. In fact, one of the reasons that we stopped where we did in the book of Revelation, when we got to the 2nd seal, is because you need to understand certain things before we continue on in the book of Revelation. Because much of what John sees in his vision is what Daniel saw in his visions. And if you don't understand what Daniel saw, it's kind of like, what's all this symbolism? But the great thing is, all of this symbolism is explained in the book of Daniel. So when we get to the book of Revelation, it's not explained. But we understand this vision is the very same vision that Daniel had. So we have to go back to the book of Daniel and we go, oh, this is what this means. Does that make sense? And last but not least, the vision of the 4 wild beasts introduces the person known as the Antichrist. It's been said that if the book of Revelation is a revelation of Jesus Christ, then the book of Daniel is a revelation of the Antichrist. And I believe that. In this particular vision, we're going to get our first real look at the Antichrist. Everyone wants to know about the Antichrist. How do we have so much information on him? We're here in this very first seal and the white horse comes out. And some people have misinterpreted thinking, well, Jesus is going to ride a white horse. Yes, but this is the Antichrist. This is the person who's going to imitate Jesus. That's why he is riding a white horse. Not only that, when he first comes on the scene, he brings peace. But how do we know so much about the Antichrist? Daniel, the vision that Daniel had. Now, let's see how the vision of the four wild beasts corresponds to Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And then we're going to see what it has to say about the Antichrist, because that's the real reason that we're actually studying this vision. We want to see what it has to say about the Antichrist. Because when we get to the book of Revelation and we know certain things about the Antichrist, people who haven't come to this portion are going to say, well, how do you know that? Well, we studied that in the book of Daniel. So let's just go through chapter 7, verse by verse, and sometimes we're going to combine verses. Look at verses 1 and 2. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. In other words, visions in his head. And then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Daniel spoke and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea. Now, the vision occurred in the first year of Belshazzar's reign. Now, we're not really certain when Belshazzar, see if I can get that right, Belshazzar started his reign. But most scholars believe that he only reigned with his father for 3 years. And we know that he was killed in 538 BC, maybe 539. So this vision probably took place in the year 541 BC, which means that Daniel was a very old man. He'd been retired for probably about 23 years. So that puts him around 85 years old when he has this vision. Now, the first thing that Daniel saw in the vision was the four winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. Now, in the Old Testament, the Great Sea always referred to the Mediterranean Sea. And it is a great sea. In fact, when we go to Israel the first night, we will stay right on the Mediterranean Sea. And if you want to go out and swim in it, you can. But it's this huge, and I would call it an ocean, but it is this huge sea. And in the Old Testament, they always referred to the Mediterranean Sea as the Great Sea. That was the Great Sea of the ancient world. If you remember, in that time, you didn't sail off into the Atlantic Ocean. Why? Well, you're going to fall off the edge of the world. The world is flat. Now, we know that the Bible teaches that the world is not flat. Did you know that? The Bible has always taught that the earth is not flat. That's interesting, isn't it? But at that time, the Gentile nations thought that the world was flat. If you sail out in the Atlantic Ocean, you're going to sail off the edge, and you're just going to go into nowhere. And as a result of that, the only place they really sailed was in the Great Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. But it also represented, the Great Sea did, the Gentile nations. Let me give you 2 examples of this. First, an Old Testament example. Look at Isaiah chapter 17, verses 12 through 13. It says, listen, the armies of many nations roar like the roaring of the sea. Hear the thunder of the mighty forces as they rush forward like thundering waves. But though they thunder like breakers on a beach, God will silence them and they will run away. They will flee like chaff scattered by the wind, like a tumbleweed whirling before a storm. Now here's what's interesting. What is he likening it to? The roaring of the sea. And the sea that they're talking about is the Mediterranean Sea. So many times the Great Sea represented the Gentile nations. Now let me give you a New Testament example. Look at Revelation chapter 17, verse number 15. Then the angel said to me, the waters where the prostitute is ruling, the sea, represents masses of people of every nation and language. Now, when it says masses of people of every nation and language, it's talking about the Gentile nations. Now for us, that's new revelation, but not to the Jew. Whenever you mention the Great Sea, it referred to the Mediterranean Sea, but it also represented the Gentile nations. Because there's only a few Gentile nations that would go through Israel, but many times they sailed from the Great Sea, and that was their coastline. And those armies would come up on the coastline like these big waves. And that's what they were talking about in Isaiah. So the Great Sea is the Mediterranean Sea, but it represents the Gentile nations. And in this vision, the four winds of heaven, God has something to do with this, is stirring up the Gentile nations just like the wind stirs up the Great Sea. And out of this stormy sea of nations, kingdoms are going to rise, which takes us to verse 3. And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse from one another. In other words, different from one another. Out of this sea, the Gentile nations, 4 different beasts came up. Now, if you remember, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the statue represented 4 kingdoms or 4 empires. The Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Grecian Empire, and the Roman Empire. These four beasts coming up out of the sea are going to correspond with the four empires in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Now, these beasts did not come up all at one time. They came up one after another. We know that because Daniel numbers them in the order that they came up. In fact, when he gets to the fourth beast, he says, after this. Why does he say that? Because after this beast came the second beast, and after the second beast came the third beast, and after the third beast came the fourth beast. So they didn't come up all at once. They came up at different times. Look at verse 4. The first was like a lion, and it had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand up on the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. Now, if you paid attention during Desert Storm, you probably noticed the symbol of Iraq. What is the symbol of Iraq? Here you go. A lion with eagle's wings, right? That was the symbol, or is the symbol of Iraq. But it's also the symbol, or was the symbol, of ancient Babylon. So here you have the Babylonian Empire rising up out of the Gentile nations. Now, what's kind of interesting, as soon as this first nation came up, Daniel knew exactly who it was. That's the symbol. I've walked in these courts. That's where I'm at right now. I know that this is the Babylonian Empire. So the first beast represents the first empire. Verse 5. And behold, another beast, a second like to a bear. And it raised up itself on one side, and had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. The second beast was like a bear. Now, the bear is one of the strongest animals alive, but it doesn't have the agility and the coordination of other wild animals. It's kind of awkward in its movement. How many of you have ever seen a bear walk? It kind of looks like it's lumbering, doesn't it? And I mean, many times it will try to sit up on a log and just roll over. It's just kind of slow and awkward and doesn't seem to have much coordination until it attacks you, right? It's awkward in its movements, but it's able to overcome its victims by brute force and sheer strength. Now, people, that's a perfect description of the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medo-Persian Empire overthrew other nations by hurling vast masses of troops against them. In fact, Xerxes conquered Greece by actually amassing an army of 2,500,000 men. Do you remember the story or the movie of the 300? Remember, Xerxes came. Xerxes was there, and he had this mass army. I mean, they couldn't believe how many. That's actually built on fact. He brought 2,500,000 troops to Greece to conquer them. That's why it was able to devour much flesh. Now, if you notice, it says that the bear raised itself up on one side. Now, what that means is when it stood up, it didn't raise up both paws. It raised up on one side and kind of tilted. Does that make sense? So what it's actually saying is one side was more dominant than the other. It didn't just come in and hit its enemy with both hands. It raised up and it swooped down with one. And of course, that represents Persia because Persia was stronger than Media. It also had, this bear did, 3 ribs in its mouth. Now, what's kind of interesting is that the Babylonian Empire was divided into 3 different provinces. So the 3 ribs represent the 3 provinces of Babylon. So as you can see, the second beast in this vision corresponds to the second kingdom in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the Medo-Persian Empire. Verse 6. After this, I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Now, what's kind of interesting is the leopard is the most agile and graceful of all the wild animals. It's in that class. It's slight in frame, but it's strong and it's swift and it's fierce. It's a perfect description of the Grecian Empire. You see, the army of Alexander the Great was very small. When you compared it to the Medo-Persian army, it was kind of amazing. They took, in a sense, a really small army, and they were able to defeat larger armies because they were well-equipped, well-trained, and very quick. With cunning and quickness, it overthrew the Persian Empire and subdued the whole civilized world. In fact, if you study military history, It was one of the first armies to actually divide its army up into different divisions. They had different responsibilities. They had different people over them. And so when they would come in, they would actually get to the battle scene before the others. They would get to a strategic location. They would scan it out, study it all, and then they would divide the army into different divisions. They would lure the enemy in, and they would conquer them that way. They were just like a leopard that's stalking its prey and waits till it gets to the right place before it strikes. But I want you to notice that the third beast had 4 heads. Why? Well, what happened to Alexander the Great? After Alexander the Great died, the empire was divided among 4 generals. We talked about this when we were looking at the dream. Cassander was over one. He took Macedonia in the western parts. Lysimachus took Thrace in the northern part of the empire. Seleucus, who took Syria in the eastern part. And Ptolemy, who took Egypt and the southern part. That's why the third beast had 4 heads. Verse 7. After this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now the iron teeth correspond to the iron legs of the image of the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The 10 horns correspond to what? The 10 toes. Yes. So the 4th beast represents who? The 4th empire, the Roman Empire. Notice that it devoured and broke in pieces, and it stamped the residue with its feet. That is a perfect description of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, people, were vicious and powerful, and it trampled upon anyone who resisted it. In fact, if anyone overcame them, they made sure, as a lesson to all other nations, that they would go back with more men and they would conquer whoever it was. When we go back to Israel, we'll take you to Masada. And Masada is a very interesting place. That was one of Herod's great temples. But you go up on this mountain, and really it was just this perfect place of protection. And it's really interesting. They built it in such a way that when it rained, and it rarely rained, but when it did, all of the water, because there's nothing around it, makes flash floods, would flow into these great cisterns that were protected. And so they could actually have their slaves go in, and they would dip this water in the system, carry it up to it, and they had all this water. It was just this wonderful place. Well, of course, in 70 AD, we all know the story, when the Romans came in and they actually conquered Jerusalem, you had some of those who went to Masada. Well, they weren't going to let anyone escape. Why? Because this is an example to the whole world that if you stand up to Rome, we will trample you down. Now, it's very interesting because it says that it actually stamped them in. Now, what's interesting about the Roman soldiers' outfit, when we look at its weapons, literally on the bottom of the sandals were these 2-inch spikes, like cleats. In fact, you would hear the Roman army actually coming down. And the reason why, think about baseball cleats. How many of you ever seen baseball cleats that have steel cleats on them? When people walk with those steel cleats in baseball and they hit that concrete, it's like click, 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 click. Well, when you have the Roman army coming and they have these 2-inch spikes on the bottom of their sandals, they're coming in, you hear them. But here's what was so scary. When they're fighting you, they literally could come out and kick you in the thigh and literally just gash open your thighs. But not only that, if you're down on the ground, they can stamp on you and drive 2-inch spikes into you, and you're not getting up. So literally what Daniel saw is a perfect description of the Roman Empire. Nothing could stand in its way. Now, in the next verse, we're going to see something new. Something we didn't see in Nebuchadnezzar's dream and in the interpretation of it. All right? You see, so far, there's nothing new in this vision. It's just from a different perspective. We're seeing the very same thing that Nebuchadnezzar saw, except it's just in a different way. It's from God's perspective. You see, Daniel knew from Nebuchadnezzar's dream that there was going to be 4 great empires. That's nothing new. And he knew that after the 4th empire fell, it was going to be revived in the last days. And that the revived Roman Empire was going to have a 10-nation confederacy. So nothing in the vision so far was anything new. But in verse number 8 and on, we're going to get some new information. And we're going to go into a heck of a lot more detail. It's new revelation. Look at verse 8. While I was contemplating the horns, the 10 horns that correspond to the 10 toes, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boast. Now some of you might be thinking, "No, Alan, we saw that little horn. That was in the vision of the ram and the he-goat." Now we kind of got things out of order because I didn't want you to get confused with Antiochus Epiphanes with the Antichrist. So we actually looked at that vision first, but that vision's actually a little bit later. And if you remember, it says, out of the 4 horns. Remember when the shaggy goat came and it hit the ram? And it broke the 2 horns, which was Medo-Persian, but there was only 1 horn in this eventually. But then it says, out of the 1 horn came 4 horns. And then it tells us that this little horn came up. And who was the little horn? Antiochus Epiphanes. But I told you that Antiochus Epiphanes was a type of the Antichrist. This is not a type. We're getting ready to see the Antichrist here, all right? So, and behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that was uttering great boast. This was something we didn't see in chapter 2. And in the midst of the 10 horns, this little horn rises up. And this horn possesses eyes like a man and a mouth like a man. So this horn isn't just a nation. What is this horn? This horn is a man. That's why when you see artists and they draw this graphic of this beast, they'll show these horns, but on this little horn you'll always see 2 eyes and a mouth. Why? Because this little horn doesn't represent a nation, it represents a man. Now, I've already let the cat out of the bag, but who is this? Can you guess? Of course, it's the Antichrist. Now, notice in verse 8 that 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots. In other words, they no longer exist. This man is going to conquer and gain complete control of 3 of the nations in this 10-nation confederacy. Almost a third of the alliance he's going to actually be over. And the rest are actually going to give him their authority and their power. In fact, if you don't mind, let's jump ahead and let's look at Revelation chapter 17, verses 12 through 13. And you're going to find out that John's vision is so similar to Daniel's. Notice what it says. The 10 horns of the beast. Wow. This could have been Daniel's vision. Are 10 kings who have not yet risen to power. They will be appointed to their kingdoms for one brief moment to reign with the beast. Now remember, I told you there's going to be a gap of time. The Roman Empire is going to fall. But it's going to rise again. And there's going to be this 10-nation confederacy. And John tells us in his vision, these kings aren't reigning. They're all going to reign in their appointed time for one brief moment. And when are they going to reign? They're going to reign, we found out, when Christ is getting ready to come. Right before he comes back. They're going to reign during the tribulation. And it says, they will all agree to give him their power and their authority. So John wasn't the first to see this vision. Daniel was. Now notice in verse number 8 that the Antichrist will utter great boast. Now people, that doesn't just mean that he's arrogant and he's going around boasting. When we see that, the first thing we think is, well, he's making these great boasts. That's not what this means. People, this is a Hebrewism. This is a figure of speech that Jews were very familiar with. When it says that he was boasting or uttering great boast, it means that he was claiming to be God or he's claiming to be as great as God. So we get our first really true picture of the Antichrist in this vision. This man is going to rise up because first the 10 kings come on the scene. So he comes up after the 10 kings. But when he comes into power, he plucks up 3 of the horns by the roots. He's completely in control of them. And then we find out, because we like to jump to the end of the book, and we find out that the others are actually going to give him their power and authority. But Daniel tells us that he is uttering these great boasts. And it's a Hebrewism. It means that he's claiming to be God. And we're going to find out a little bit further in the book of Daniel that he's going to demand to be worshipped. Now this is very interesting because Antiochus Epiphanes claimed to be God and wanted to be worshipped. And that's supposedly the abomination of desolation. But when Jesus is teaching, which is after that period of time, he acts like the abomination of desolation hasn't even taken place. Why does he do that? The reason he does that is because he sees this for when it's really going to happen, which is in the tribulation. He understands that Antiochus Epiphanes is just a type. Now, if this vision truly corresponds with Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2, how would we expect this vision to end? What happened in Nebuchadnezzar's dream? It wasn't just the four kingdoms. What happened? This stone was cut out of a mountain without hands. And this rock smashed the feet. And all of the statue crumbled in the wind that blew it away. And then that rock did what? It grew into a mountain, and it covered the entire earth. Right? Now, we know that stone is Jesus. He is the rock of our salvation. And we know that when that stone grew into a mountain, it's his kingdom. This kingdom is actually going to destroy this 10-nation confederacy. That's what it meant when it smashed the feet. It destroyed this 10-nation confederacy. And then when it says that it grew into a mountain and it spread over the entire earth, what it means is his kingdom was over the entire earth. And then it said it was going to last forever. So, if the vision in chapter 7 corresponds to Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2, what should we see in the next few verses? Well, we should see the return of Jesus Christ, right? Would you expect to see that? And we should see him striking the 10-nation confederacy, the feet of clay and iron, and we should see him establishing his kingdom here upon the earth. Well, guess what? That's exactly what we're going to see in verses 9 through 14. And we're also going to get a lot more information about this than we did in chapter 2. In chapter 2, it was just kind of symbolisms. Not here. He actually sees in the vision almost exactly what John saw in his revelation. There's 6 verses that's dedicated to just this one little part. So let's look at verses 9 through 14. We'll go through them quickly. Verse 9. I kept looking until the thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. Remind you of anyone? His throne was ablaze with flames, and its wheels were burning fire. Now we're going to see the judgment that's going to fall on the Gentile nations, and it's not going to be pretty. See, from the time of the Babylonian captivity all the way into the end of the tribulation, this is known as the times of the Gentiles. And the times of the Gentiles is not the same as the fullness of the Gentiles. When we think of the fullness of the Gentiles, what are we talking about? We're talking about the church age. Because the Jews rejected Jesus, the Gentiles were grafted in. That's the church age. That's the fullness of the Gentiles. And when the fullness of the Gentiles is reached, in other words, everyone that's going to come in that's going to be saved is here. And everything's just right, we're going to be raptured out. At that point, the church age is over, we're raptured, the tribulation begins. But the times of the Gentiles is still going on. Now here's the whole thing that the Jews have always been wondering. If we're God's chosen people, why are the Gentiles ruling over us? Even now, I want you to understand something. Even though Israel is in control of its own nation, it does what we tell it to. What America tells it to. Did you know that? So in a sense, the Gentile nations are still ruling Israel. And they want to know, when's it going to stop? When is it going to stop? When Jesus comes back. Does that make sense? Now, all of a sudden, at this point, the thrones are set up. What did we study in chapter 5? When we finished chapters 2 and 3, we went to 4 and 5. We saw the rapture, but we also saw a vision of heaven. And there wasn't just one throne. There were thrones around the throne of God. Do you remember that? John was not the first to see that. Daniel was. And so now judgment's going to fall upon the Gentile nations. It's not going to be pretty. Verse 10. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court sat, and the books were opened. Now, normally when we think of God sitting on his throne, what do we think of? We think of a river of living water flowing from his throne, blessing the nations. Is that not what you think of? Yes, but that's not the picture. Here it's a river of fire. That's because it's judgment time, baby. When the tribulation happens, all of those who are in Christ Jesus, they're out of here. This is judgment time on the Gentile nations. Now, again, we're gone, but those who are left behind, the Gentiles, they're going to have to face the judgment of God. And now all of a sudden, God's going to be upon Israel's side, and he's going to use this tribulation to bring them back to faith in Christ Jesus, to draw them back to him. But I want you to notice something else. Notice that thousands of thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. Does that remind you of anything that we studied? Remember the angels? What did John say? He said, I saw in Revelations 5:11. Look there. And I looked, and I heard the voice of many angels around the throne, and the living creatures and the elders. And the number of them was myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands. Could Daniel have written that? Not only could he have written it, he did. This is what Daniel saw. Daniel saw the very same thing as John. That's why as we go through the book of Revelation, we'll keep going back to Daniel. And then it says the books were opened. Books refer to an accounting system. So what this is telling us, it's judgment day. God's not forgotten anything. Now the books are opened. You're going to have to give an account of what's taking place. And who is the first to get judged? Verse 11. I beheld then, because of the voice of the great words which the horn spoke, not the 10, the little horn. And because of the voice of the great words which the horn spoke, I beheld even till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed, and given to the burning flame. Now this beast not only refers to the 10-nation confederacy, the revived Roman Empire, but also to the Antichrist. That's why we refer to the Antichrist many times as the beast. You'll find that in Revelation. What's another name for the Antichrist? The beast. So the beast, which is this 10-nation confederacy, but we're going to find out God has something special planned for this Antichrist. It's slain. And the leader of the Antichrist, or the leader of the 10-nation confederacy, the Antichrist, is thrown into the lake of fire. Now people, this is exactly what John saw in Revelation 19, verses 19 through 21. Notice what it says. Then I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered to make war against the rider on the horse and his army. Now, what's he referring to the Antichrist as here? The beast. Now, he's not referring to the beast here in Revelation as the 10-nation confederacy. Why? Because he says, I saw the beast and the kings of the earth. These kings are the 10 kings. They were gathered together to make war against the rider on the horse and his army. Who's the rider on the horse? Jesus. It's not this one who is the counterfeit. It's the true one that's coming back with us. But the beast was captured, and with him the false prophet who had performed the miraculous signs on his behalf. With these signs he had deluded those who had received the mark of the beast and worshipped his image. Those who received the mark of the Antichrist. And they worshipped the Antichrist. Does that make sense? The two of them, the beast and the false prophet. This is kind of interesting. We talk about the Trinity. I'm going to get ahead of myself. We talk about the Trinity, which is God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. Do you realize there's a satanic Trinity? There's the devil, the Antichrist, and who? The false prophet. And what we see is for everything that God does, Satan has a counterfeit. These two of them were thrown, now notice this, alive into the fiery lake of burning sulfur. The rest of them were killed with the sword that came out of the mouth of the rider on the horse, and all the birds gorged themselves on their flesh. Now look back in verse 12 in Daniel chapter 7. Now we're back in Daniel. As for the rest of the beast, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. Now this is hard to understand unless you understand that this should have been in parentheses. If it was in parentheses, it would help you to understand, because this is not in chronological order in this vision. He's just giving you, well, what happened to the other three beasts? How many of you are thinking, well, what happened to the other three beasts that came up? Well, he tells us. You see, he's just telling you what happened to them in history. Their dominion was taken away. The Medo-Persian Empire took the Babylonian dominion away. The Grecian Empire took the Medo-Persian's dominion away. And the Roman Empire took the Greeks' dominion away. But they all had their season in the sun, and their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. In other words, God's judgment did not come upon them like it did or it will on this 10-nation confederacy that rises up against God. See, this 10-nation confederacy that rises up, it's going to wage war against God. And let me tell you, it won't win. Jesus wins. Last week, we began studying the vision of the four wild beasts. And because of time, we were unable to finish. So tonight, we're going to pick up where we left off. But before we do that, I want to do a real quick overview of everything that we've covered in Daniel so far. I want you to be very familiar with this book. And the reason I want you to be familiar with this book is because Daniel holds the key to understanding the book of Revelation. You see, so much of the symbolism in Revelation is explained in the book of Daniel. And the reason so many of you have read through the book of Revelation and you didn't understand it is because you didn't understand the book of Daniel. But here's what's great about the book of Daniel. When Daniel had these visions, he didn't know what the interpretation of the visions were either. So guess what Daniel did? Daniel said, "What is this?" And he would ask questions to the person in his vision. And they would give him the interpretation of the vision. Now, here's what's interesting. All of those visions that he had and all of those things there, John sees the very same visions. There might be a slight difference, but it's basically the very same thing. So if we want to know what those symbolisms are, all we have to do is go back to the book of Daniel. That's why we spent so much time on the book of Daniel. So let's do a real quick overview of what we covered so far. First, we had Nebuchadnezzar's dream. By now, you should have this memorized. Do you? Good. In the dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw this huge statue of a man. The head of the statue was made of gold. The chest and arms were silver, the belly and thighs were bronze, the legs were iron, and the feet were a combination of iron and baked clay. And as Nebuchadnezzar was looking at the statue, this rock was cut out of a mountain without hands. And the rock came and it smashed the feet of iron and baked clay. And all of the idol or all of the statue came crumbling to the ground. And then the wind blew all the pieces away until it was no longer there. And then this rock became a great big mountain, and the mountain covered the entire earth. That was Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and it troubled him. He knew it was important. He knew it was a spiritual dream, that God had given him this dream, but he didn't know what it meant. So he called all of his wise men, and he said, "Tell me what the dream is, and then tell me the interpretation." Now, the way the King James says it, it's almost as if he couldn't remember what the dream is. But when you actually go back to the original Hebrew, there's some question there. I truly believe that he remembered the dream, but he also knew that if he told them what the dream is, they just make something up. So the only sure way of knowing whether or not they were giving him the correct interpretation was that they could also tell him what he dreamed. Because if they could tell him what he dreamed, he knew they could interpret it. And he told them, "You either tell me what the dream is and interpret it, or I'm going to execute every one of you." Now, Daniel wasn't there. So by the time the message gets to Daniel that he's going to be executed, he goes, "Wait a minute. You go tell the king that I can tell him what he dreamed and what he interpreted if he'll just give me a little bit of time to seek God." And of course, he had an all-night prayer meeting, and God gave him a vision of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And so he went into the king and he said, "This is your dream, and this is the interpretation." He said, "This statue represents different kingdoms, and you are the head of gold. The Babylonian Empire is that head of gold on the statue. But your empire is not going to last forever. Another empire is going to take your place. That empire is represented by the chest and arms of silver on the statue. And then that empire will not last forever either. That empire is going to fall, and another empire is going to take its place. And that empire is represented by the abdomen and the buttocks, or you might say thighs, of bronze on the statue. And that empire is not going to last forever. Another empire is going to take its place, and that fourth and last empire is going to be made out of iron. But that fourth and last empire will eventually evolve into a 10-nation confederacy. But the kingdom of God in the end times is going to smash the confederacy of 10 kings, and the kingdom of God is going to be set up upon the earth or established on the earth, and it will last forever and ever. Now, if you remember, Daniel didn't tell Nebuchadnezzar or us who the second empire was going to be, or the third, or the fourth. He didn't tell Nebuchadnezzar because he didn't know at the time. It wasn't revealed to him. But later on in life, Daniel had other visions. And in another vision, God filled in the blanks. He revealed who the second empire was going to be and who the third empire was going to be in a vision known as the ram and the he-goat. We study that in Daniel chapter 8. Now, in that vision, Daniel saw a large ram with 2 horns. The ram with 2 horns represented the Medo-Persian Empire. Look at Daniel chapter 8, verse number 20. It says, the 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. So that's the second empire, the one that took Babylon's place. And as Daniel was watching the ram, a goat from the west with 1 horn ran towards it. And he hit the ram, and he broke the 2 horns of the ram, and he knocked the ram over, and he stamped on it until he killed the ram. And then the goat with the 1 horn represented who? The Grecian Empire. Look at Daniel chapter 8, verse number 21. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. That king, of course, was Alexander the Great. And then the 1 horn on the goat, it broke. And out of that 1 horn came 4 horns representing 4 kings. And that's what eventually happened. When Alexander the Great died, his kingdom was divided between his 4 generals. They each took a piece of the kingdom. Does that make sense? And then out of one of the 4 horns in his vision, a little horn arose. That little horn was who? Antiochus Epiphanes. And Antiochus Epiphanes was a type of the Antichrist. He was not the Antichrist because he came out of one of the 4 horns. We know that the Antichrist is going to come out of what? The 10 horns. The next empire. So who was this little horn? He was a type of the Antichrist. And I told you a little bit about him. If you remember, Antiochus Epiphanes made a peace treaty with Israel in order to pass through their land to go to Egypt. And he attacked Egypt, and he had conquered all of Egypt with one exception. He hadn't conquered Alexandria yet. And so on his way to Alexandria, a messenger from Rome came, and the messenger from Rome said, the Senate of Rome says that you need to back off. You need to retreat and withdraw your troops, or Rome is going to declare war on you. And what did Antiochus do? He said, well, let me talk this over with my counselors. And the messenger pulled out a sword, and he drew a circle. He actually just drug his sword all the way around him. And he said, before you step out of that circle, you better have made your decision. Because if you step out of that circle, we're going to take it that you're declaring war on Rome. Well, Antiochus Epiphanes knew that he could not stand against the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire was not at its zenith of power yet. It didn't reach that until Trajan came in, but it was still very powerful. And Antiochus Epiphanes knew that he would lose everything that he had worked for if he went up against the Roman Empire. And so he had to withdraw in humiliation. But because he was humiliated, he became very, very angry. And who could he take it out on? There was no cat to kick, right? So he went through the Jews' land, and because he was so upset, he took his wrath out upon the Jews. He desecrated the temple by sacrificing a pig. He put up a statue of himself in the temple, and he said, I am God, or I'm as great as God, and I want you to worship this statue. He burned the scriptures. He banned circumcision. And the list goes on and on and on. But all of the things that he did to the Jews was just a foreshadow of what the real Antichrist will do. If you want a good picture of what the Antichrist is going to do, go do your own study of Antiochus Epiphanes, because he is a type of the Antichrist. And the reason he was brought up is because God wanted us to see what this man is going to be like. He's going to have so much more power than Antiochus Epiphanes ever dreamed of. And what Antiochus Epiphanes did to the Jews is just a little bit of what the Antichrist is going to do. Now, we're studying at this time the vision of the 4 wild beasts. This vision corresponds to Nebuchadnezzar's dream. In other words, the four beasts that Daniel saw in this vision correspond to the four kingdoms in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The first beast was a lion with wings. It represented the Babylonian Empire. In fact, a lion with wings was the symbol of ancient Babylon. It's kind of interesting, but if you look at the symbol of Iraq, if you remember the Gulf War, what was it? The very same symbol, a lion with wings, or the wings of an eagle. The second beast was a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth. The bear represented the Medo-Persian Empire. The 3 ribs in its mouth represented the 3 provinces of Babylon that the Medes and the Persians had to conquer in order to be the next great world empire. The third beast was a leopard with 4 heads. The leopard represented Greece because it is the quickest of all the wild animals, and it is so coordinated and it is so graceful. And that really showed the armies of Greece, because Alexander the Great took just a small number of troops and he actually conquered the Medo-Persian Empire, even though they had so many more troops than what he had. But he was so quick and he was so advanced in his warfare that he was able to do that. And that's kind of like the leopard. The leopard can take down much greater and larger animals and even stronger animals than himself. But he can do that because he's so quick and he's so cunning and he can strike and he's very, very strong. Now, the leopard had 4 heads. The 4 heads represented the 4 divisions of the Grecian Empire. Now, if you remember, as I said, after Alexander the Great died, his empire was divided among 4 of his generals. And the last beast wasn't like anything in nature. It had iron teeth and it devoured everything in its path. It also had 10 horns. The iron teeth correspond to the iron legs in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and the 10 horns correspond to the 10 toes. So the 4th beast represents who? Rome, the Roman Empire. Now, as Daniel was contemplating the 10 horns, this little horn popped up. And the little horn had the eyes of a man and the mouth of a man. Now, this tells us that this little horn is not a nation. This little horn is a man. The little horn represents the Antichrist. And at the end of the vision, Daniel saw the Ancient of Days sitting on the throne. And the Gentile nations were judged, and the 4th beast was slain and thrown into the fire, and God established his kingdom upon the earth, and it lasted forever and ever. And that's where we stopped last week. So we're going to pick it up where we left off last week. Let's pick it up in verse 16, and we're going to read verses 16 through 18. That's a pretty good little overview, wasn't it? Verses 16 through 18. I approached one of those standing there, and I asked him the true meaning of all this. In other words, this vision of the 4 wild beasts. So he told me, and he gave me the interpretation of these things. The 4 great beasts are 4 kingdoms that will rise from the earth. But the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever, yes, forever and ever. Now, as you can see, Daniel wanted to know what this vision meant, so he asked. And one of the angels that was around the throne of God gave him this quick general interpretation of the vision of the 4 wild beasts. The 4 beasts represents the 4 kingdoms. But the kingdom of God is going to prevail in the end. And God's kingdom is going to last forever and ever. Now, if you think about it, that's the very same interpretation as Nebuchadnezzar's dream, right? Yes. That's why I say that the vision of the 4 wild beasts corresponds to Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Though they were different, one was a dream and the other a vision, they had the very same meaning. But Daniel wasn't satisfied with this simple explanation. Oh no, he already knew that. It's almost like you have this vision and it's totally different and you're expecting something great. And they give you this interpretation. You go, wait a minute, I already knew that when you gave me the vision of Nebuchadnezzar's dream and you gave me the interpretation of it. So Daniel's curiosity wasn't satisfied. He wanted more information about the 4th beast and the 10 horns, and especially this little horn that came up with the eyes and the mouth of a man. You see, he knew there had to be more to the vision because there was so much more detail in this vision than there was in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And Daniel wanted to know what all of these details meant. And thank God he asked. Now, I think that God prompted him to do that, but look at verses 19 through 22. Then I wanted to know the true meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws, the beast that crushed and devoured its victims, and it trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head, and I wanted to know about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell, the horn that looked more imposing than the others, and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the saints and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came when they possessed the kingdom. Now, Daniel had a lot of questions about this fourth beast. He didn't care about the first 3. They were going to pass away. He knew that. But he knew, because God had told him earlier, that this vision had to do with the end times. And he knew that the fourth beast was dealing with the end times. So he had a lot of questions about this last beast, the 10 horns, and especially, as I said, this little bitty horn that came up. And as he was asking the angel about these things, he saw this little horn waging war against the saints. Look at verse number 21 again. And as I watched, this horn was waging war against the saints. Now notice this, and defeating them. Now who's the little horn? I've already told you. It's the Antichrist. So Daniel saw the Antichrist waging war against the saints. Now, whenever Daniel uses the term saints, it's used in the Old Testament context, not the New Testament context. In the New Testament, saints are who? Born-again believers. When you read the term saints in the New Testament, it's referring to born-again believers. But saints does not refer to born-again believers in the Old Testament. They hadn't even heard of born-again believers. In the Old Testament, saints referred to God's chosen people, the Jews. So the saints the Antichrist is waging war on are the Jews, not born-again believers. Born-again believers are raptured before the Antichrist ever comes on the scene. Do you remember that? Here we were in Revelation chapter 4, verse number 1. It says that a window opened up in heaven, and all of a sudden, John was translated up there. In other words, he was raptured to heaven. And John's rapture to heaven is a type of the church. So once he's raptured, and we see this vision of heaven, the very next person who comes on the scene is who? The Antichrist. The rider on the first horse. That's the Antichrist. So Daniel sees this Antichrist waging war on the Jews during the tribulation. But there's no time frame in here, so we got to go a little bit further. We're going to see this in a little bit. But right now, look at verse number 22 in context with verse 21. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the saints and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the saints of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. Who? The saints possessed the kingdom. The final victory belongs to God. Christ is going to return. We know the end of the story. He is going to defeat the beast, and his kingdom is going to be established upon this earth. Now, in verse 23 and on, the angel is going to honor Daniel's request for more information, and he's going to explain this vision in great detail. What's kind of interesting, that little bit we just read, the angel hasn't even explained anything. We just see it from what Daniel saw when he was asking the question. But from verse 23 and on, now this angel, this person who's around the throne of God, so we're actually assuming it's an angel. It could be one of the 24 elders, doesn't say. But a person around the throne, he starts answering his questions, and he goes into much detail. Look in verse 23. He gave me this explanation. The fourth beast is the fourth kingdom that will appear on the earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms, and it will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. And people, that's exactly what the Roman Empire did. It's past history for us, but it was future for Daniel. When was this vision written? Does anyone remember? What's the time frame? Around 544 BC. Daniel is an old man. He's worn out after these visions. It takes everything out of him. But he wrote this in 544 BC. The Grecian Empire hasn't even come on the scene. The Medes and the Persians are ruling. They look to be like they're going to be the empire that's going to last forever. But no, he saw the Grecian Empire coming. The Roman Empire came after the Grecian Empire. So he wrote this in 544, or saw this vision in 544 BC. Verse 24. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. 10 kings are going to rise up from what used to be the Roman Empire. It's going to come from those locations on the earth in which the Roman Empire used to reign or have dominion. And soon after these 10 kings come to power, another king is going to come. That king's the Antichrist. Now, let me just stop right here. The Antichrist comes on the scene at the first seal. We've just been raptured. There is a good chance that we will see these 10 kings come to power. We may not. But it says that the 10 kings come first before the little horn pops up. Does that make sense? And when the little horn pops up, the Antichrist is on the scene, and he's the first rider of the first seal. So I just want you to know that. Now, the king that he's talking about is this Antichrist, and it says he's going to subdue 3 of the 10 kings. Now, I want you to underline that word subdue. Hopefully you've turned to this place in your Bible. The word subdue is translated from the Aramaic word shephal. It means to overthrow or to humiliate. Now, in this context, it means he's going to overthrow 3 of the 10 kings. But these 3 kings will probably remain as figureheads, but he's in complete control. Probably when he overthrows these 3 kings, the other 7 says, let's get in line because we could be next. Now, I'm assuming that. It doesn't say that. But it says that he pulls up by the roots these 3. But we find out later in the book of Revelations because John sees just about the very same vision. And he sees these 10 horns come up. And guess what? 3 of the 10 are still kings, which means when he overthrows those 3 kings, he allows them to remain as figureheads. Verse 25. And he shall speak great words against the Most High. And he shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and he shall think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time, and times, and the dividing of time. Now, to turn to someone next to you and say, I can understand this because Pastor Allen's going to make it very easy to understand. You didn't want to say that. All right. Now, contrary to what most people think, speaking great words against the Most High doesn't just mean he's blaspheming. See, when we read that, he was speaking great words against the Most High, we think, oh, he was blaspheming. No, it means that he's claiming to be God, or he's claiming to be just as great as God. Now, once the Antichrist does that, he's going to turn on the Jews. You see, we're going to find out just a little bit later, for the first 3.5 years, he's the Jews' friend, just like Antiochus Epiphanes was when he went through Israel. When the Antichrist needs Israel, he's going to be their best friend. But midway through, that's all going to change. So what's going to happen is he's going to claim to be as great as God. Now, once he claims to be as great as God, he's going to turn on the Jews. The phrase wear out, it says he's going to wear out the saints. That phrase wear out is translated from the Aramaic word bela. In this context, it means to oppress or to persecute. So he's going to persecute the Jews. Remember, the saints in the Old Testament does not refer to born-again believers. It refers to who? The Jews. So he's going to persecute the Jews. That's why so many people thought that Hitler was the Antichrist in World War II. Why? Because he was persecuting the Jews. This has to be the Antichrist. But he wasn't. He was a type of the Antichrist, but he wasn't the Antichrist. Not only is the Antichrist going to claim to be as great as God and persecute the Jews, but he's also going to change the times and laws. Now, people, this is where it really gets good, so pay close attention. Times and laws is a figure of speech. It's a Hebrewism. Now, if we were on the East and everyone was kind of educating this, we would say Hebraism. But I'm always going to speak like Cherokee County, so it's a Hebrewism. It's a figure of speech. You see, the rabbis refer to the Sabbath and the 3 Jewish feasts. Do you know what I'm talking about when I say the 3 Jewish feasts? The Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. So, the rabbis always referred to the Sabbath and these three Jewish feasts as times. Why? Because God set times for men to observe the holy days. So the Sabbath and the three Jewish feasts were referred to as times. Look at Deuteronomy 16:6. 3 times in a year shall all my males appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose, in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and in the Feast of Weeks, and in the Feast of Tabernacles. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty. The Sabbath was a time set by God for men to rest and to worship God. So when it talks about times, it's talking about the Sabbath and these three Jewish feasts. The law, because he's going to change the times and the laws. The law refers to the Levitical law. In other words, the laws of God outlined in the book of Leviticus. How many of you have read through the book of Leviticus? Good book. Most of you might not like that, but I really enjoyed it. In the book of Leviticus, you're going to find the different types of sacrifices and offerings that are to be offered to God and how they're supposed to be performed by the priest. It also details what's considered to be clean and unclean. This is what you can eat, and this is what you can't eat. This is what you can plow with, and this is what you can't plow with. This is what you can wear, and this is what you can't wear. It also outlines the specific duties of the priest, what the priests were supposed to do when they approached God, what they were supposed to do for the people. So he's going to change the Jewish times and the Levitical law. Now let me explain what this means. We're going to make it very, very simple. In Daniel chapter 9, verse number 27, we're told that the Antichrist is going to make a 7-year peace treaty with Israel. And in this peace treaty, he's going to allow them to rebuild the temple. Now, I already told you, when we went over to Israel, we met with the Temple Institute. This is a group of Orthodox Jews that has already built and is still in the process of making all of the Levites' uniforms. I guess that's the best way to say it, garments. They've made all of the articles that go into the temple. In fact, if you go back to Israel with me, you'll literally see a menorah in plexiglass that's worth about $2.5 to $3 million of pure gold. The thing is huge. It's made to the specific dimensions that God gave Moses to put in the temple. Why? Because they believe the temple is going to be rebuilt. And when this Antichrist comes on the scene, he's going to make this peace treaty with Israel, and he's going to tell them in this peace treaty, you can rebuild the temple. But after 3.5 years, he's going to break the treaty. Now here's what's interesting. Hopefully you'll look back at this. Here is the seventh trumpet. The last trumpet signals the first half of the tribulation is over, and it begins the 7 vials of God. Now, at that point, everything's going to break loose because the Antichrist is going to break the treaty he made with Israel. And when he breaks the treaty, he's going to stop the Jews from offering sacrifices in the temple. And he's going to set up a sacrilegious object in the temple, and he's going to tell them, you must worship it. People, that's changing the Levitical law because God told them what they're supposed to sacrifice and how they're supposed to do it. He told them what's to go in the temple and what's not. But the Antichrist is going to change this in the middle of the 3.5 years. Now, Pastor, how do you know that? Daniel. Look in Daniel chapter 9, verse number 27. The ruler. Who's the ruler? The ruler will be the Antichrist. He will make a treaty with the people. Who's the people? Daniel's writing to the Jews. He will make a treaty with the Jews for a period of 1 set of 7. In other words, for 7 years. But after half of this time, he's going to put an end to the sacrifices and offerings. And as a climax to all of his terrible deeds, he's going to set up a sacrilegious object that causes desecration. Daniel saw all of this. Now, in the Antichrist's desire to annihilate all of the Jewish institutions, he'll even change the Sabbath and Jewish feast. That's what verse 25 means in Daniel chapter 7 when it says, he'll think to change times and laws. He'll stop the sacrifices and oblations. He'll set up a religious system that's totally contrary to the Levitical law. He'll change the Sabbath and the 3 Jewish feasts to something else. And that's when the Jews know, oh no, we've been duped. And when they say to the Antichrist, no way, you cannot change the Levitical law. You cannot change the times in the law. God gave us the times and God gave us the laws. You cannot change that. Then the Antichrist is going to be filled with rage, just like Antiochus Epiphanes, and he's going to turn his wrath upon them. Now, if you notice, when we get to this interlude, and I'll explain what an interlude is, when we get to chapter 10 of Revelation through verse 11, we're going to find out that the temple is rebuilt. It doesn't tell us when because it's an interlude, but we know when, at the first of the tribulation. But guess what? That's when it first comes on the scene. But then we're going to find out all of a sudden, halfway through, at the seventh trumpet, he goes in to change the times in the law. He goes in and he wants to change the Sabbath, and he wants to change the 3 Jewish feasts, and he wants to change the way God said to worship him and how to conduct yourself in the temple. And when he does that, the Jews are going to say, no way. You cannot change the times and the laws. And he's going to turn on them and he is going to oppress them just as Daniel said. Now, notice the last part of verse 25. Let's turn back to Daniel 7. And he shall speak great words against the Most High. I'm as great as God, or I am God. He shall wear out the saints of the Most High. In other words, oppress them. Why? Because he thought to change times and laws. Now notice this. When he thinks to change times and laws, he wants to change everything. And the Jews say, you can't do that. God told us how to do this in Leviticus. Guess what? They shall be given into his hand until a time and times in the dividing of time. In other words, they, the Jews, are going to be given into his hand. So the Jews are going to be given into his hand until a time and times in a dividing of time. In other words, they're going to be persecuted by the Antichrist for a certain length of time. Now, how long is a time and times and half a time? Will you meet me at the Keys ball game in a time and a times and a half a time? You don't know what that is, do you? All right. It's 3.5 years. How do you know that, Pastor? Well, the word time is translated from the Aramaic word idon. And idon can mean one of two things. It can either refer to a specific duration of time, and then you have to specify it. But if you don't specify it, it refers to a year. No time is specified, so guess what it refers to? A year. So he says they're going to be given into his hand for a time, 1 year, and times, 2 years, and the dividing of time, which is a half a year, which equals 3.5 years. Everything that John's going to tell us in the book of Revelation. It's not hard to understand Revelation when you understand Daniel. Now, for clarification purposes, the word times in the previous phrase, when it says he will change times and laws, is a different Aramaic word. It's the Aramaic word zimon. And I just wanted to clarify that. In fact, can you put up verse 25 again? Can you go back? Thank you. And it says, and he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change the times and laws. That word times is not the same Aramaic word as these 3 words for times. This Aramaic word is zimon. Now, these down here, time, times, and time is idon. All right? So don't confuse that. Does that make sense? That makes sense to me. Watch the DVD again. Verse 26 through 29. But then the court will pass judgment, and all this power will be taken away and completely destroyed. Whose court are we talking about? God's. Do you remember when we saw the scene in heaven in the book of Revelation chapter 4 and chapter 5? We saw the throne of God, but it also said there were thrones, plural. God's holding court. And he will pass judgment. And all of his power, talking about the Antichrist power, is going to be taken away and completely destroyed. Then the sovereignty, the power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be given to the holy people of the Most High. Now all of a sudden they're not referred to as saints. Interesting. His kingdom will last forever, and all rulers will serve and obey him. That was the end of the vision. And I, Daniel, was terrified by my thoughts. Not by the vision, but his thoughts of what a time this is going to be in the end. And my face was pale with fear, but I kept these things to myself. Now, verse 27 tells us that Christ's kingdom is going to be established upon this earth. And with Christ reigning on the earth, guess what? There will be no more wars. What's going to happen after Christ establishes his kingdom? Well, Isaiah chapter 2, verse number 4 tells us. He tells us that men are going to beat their swords, in other words, their weapons, into plowshares. And it says that no nation will have a military. Look at Isaiah 2:4. He will judge between the nations, talking about Christ, and he will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation. Now listen to this. Nor will they train for war anymore. What do you do in the military? You train the men for war. No nation will train for war anymore. Why? Because Christ's kingdom has been established upon the earth. Now, people, listen to me very closely. I would love to have world peace, but it's never going to happen until Christ Jesus comes. You can visualize world peace all day long, but it's never going to happen until Jesus comes back. So until then, America better have not just a strong military, but America better have the strongest military in the world, and they better have a president that understands that. And it doesn't matter if the Unitarian Church puts these little signs out that says, visualize world peace. Now, people, I hate to disrespect the dead, but John Lennon was an idiot. Imagine all the people. And he got shot. Maybe he didn't visualize world peace enough. And I'm not trying to disrespect him, but you need to understand something. The United Nations is useless. Ever since it was created and its purpose was to, how many of you know the purpose of the United Nations? It was to stop wars. In fact, what's kind of interesting is the United Nations goal is Isaiah 2:4. Did you know that? And they actually take this passage of Scripture and try to weave it into this mission. Now, how many have ever seen the artwork that's outside of the United Nations? Let's show the first picture. This is a man that is beating his sword into, guess what? A plow. Where's that taken from? Isaiah 2:4. Let's go to the next one. Here is another piece of artwork outside the United Nations. It's a pistol and its barrel has been wrapped around to be useless. Why? Because men will not study war anymore. In other words, you will not train your men. But people, that's not going to happen. And let me just say this. The kingdom of God is not established upon the earth until after the battle of Armageddon. In Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the rock came and it smashed this feet of iron and baked clay. Jesus will come back, and when he comes back as a warrior. He literally is going to speak the word, and the Bible tells us that the blood is going to flow as high as the bridle of a horse. When Jesus comes back, he declares war on these Gentile nations, and he wipes them out. But once he sets up his kingdom, there will be no more wars. But the reason there has to be a war is because this is a war between good and evil. This is a war between those who rebelled against God and God. And you better be on God's side. Now, as we begin to go through the book of Revelation, can I finish with one last thing? Thank you. When we begin to go through the book of Revelation and we see this horrible tribulation, many of you are going to wonder, why would God do this? God has a purpose. Daniel chapter 11, verse number 35, it's not going to pop up here because I'm not there yet, tells us that his purpose is to refine the Jews and to purge them and to bring them back. His whole purpose is to bring the Jewish nation unto repentance to Jesus Christ. And the only way he can do this is to allow this Antichrist, the thing they're looking for, to come into power. And when they think, oh, he's the greatest person, he's the one, and they're going to finally get what they want, then they're going to recognize what Daniel said, and they're going to see that he changed the times and the laws. They're going to open their eyes. They're going to go back and study Daniel, and they're going to find out that the Messiah was cut off just like he said. They're going to figure out the times. They're going to read the book of Matthew, and they're going to repent as a nation and come into Jesus Christ. God has a purpose, and it will be fulfilled.